Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, I invite you to join me on perhaps our most extraordinary journey, yet the complete story of Canute the Great, England's forgotten Viking king whose name should echo alongside those of Alexander and Caesar, yet somehow remains whispered only in the shadows of history. Picture this, a young Danish prince standing on windswept shores, watching his father's mighty fleet prepare for the conquest of England. That boy would grow up to rule an empire that stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the Baltic Sea, commanding the loyalty of Vikings and Saxons alike, receiving the friendship of emperors and the blessing of popes. Yet today, most people know him only for a legend about commanding the tides. They know him at all. This is the story of a ruler who achieved what no one before or since has managed: the complete unification of the North Sea world under a single crown. Imagine medieval Europe's greatest empire, where English silver funded Danish longships, where Norwegian warriors fought alongside Saxon thanes, where trade flowed freely across seas that had once separated bitter enemies. This was Canute's achievement, an empire built not just through conquest, but through the revolutionary idea that former enemies could become brothers under wise and just rule. Tonight, we'll discover how a Viking raider transformed himself into medieval Europe's most sophisticated diplomat, how brutal battles gave way to unprecedented prosperity, and how a foreign conqueror became so beloved by his English subjects that they mourned his death as deeply as any native-born king. From the blood-soaked beaches of his first invasion to the marble halls of Rome where emperors sought his friendship, this is a tale of transformation, ambition, and the eternal human dream of unity in a fractured world. But here's what makes this journey special. I need you to be part of it with me. The comments section has been far too quiet lately, and I'm wondering if you're all just silently drifting off to sleep without saying hello. Your voices and stories are what make this community magical. So please, before you settle in for the night, take just a moment to leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from, what draws you to Viking history, or simply say goodnight so I know you're here with us. Are you a long-time medieval history enthusiast? Or is tonight your first glimpse into the world of ancient kings and forgotten empires? Your comments truly inspire every word I write and every tale I tell. They help other history lovers discover our peaceful community, and they remind me that somewhere out there, people still find magic in the stories of those who came before us. Plus, I'm genuinely curious, what is it about these ancient tales that helps you find peace at the end of a long day? Do you dream of longships and castle walls? Or do these stories simply quiet the noise of modern life? Please, don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Every like helps thoughtful, detailed historical content reach more people who need these peaceful stories, and every subscription ensures that these tales continue to find their way to the dreamers and history lovers who cherish them most. Ring that notification bell too, because you never know when inspiration will strike, and I'll have another epic tale ready to share now. As you settle into your favorite listening position, close your eyes and let your imagination drift back over 1,000 years. Feel the salt spray of the North Sea. Hear the creak of wooden ships and the distant sound of ceremonial horns announcing the arrival of kings. Tonight, you're not just a listener, you're a witness to one of history's greatest stories, a tale of how a young Viking warrior became the most powerful ruler in medieval Europe. Welcome to the complete story of Canute the Great. Welcome to an empire that changed the world. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where the past comes alive in whispers and dreams. Let our journey begin. Cnut, later known as Canute the Great, was born into a world where the clash of steel and the creak of locked hulls echoed across the northern seas like a lullaby of conquest. Around the year 990, in the windswept kingdoms of Denmark, a child entered the world who would one day command the waves that separated England from Scandinavia, and whose name would be whispered in both reverence and fear from the fjords of Norway to the rolling hills of Wessex. The exact location of Canut's birth remains shrouded in the mists of time, much like the fog that rolls across the Baltic Sea on autumn mornings. What we do know is that he was born to greatness, the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, one of the most formidable Viking kings to ever set sail from Danish shores. But even in this tale of royal lineage, mystery weaves through the narrative like a gentle stream through a medieval forest. The child who would become Canute the Great drew his first breath in a Denmark that was rapidly transforming from a collection of petty kingdoms into a unified realm under his grandfather's rule. Harald Bluetooth, Canute's grandfather, had been one of the first Scandinavian monarchs to embrace Christianity, marking a pivotal moment when the old gods of Asgard began to yield to the cross of Christ. This transition from the ancient ways to the new faith would profoundly influence Canute's own approach to kingship, creating in him a ruler who could navigate both the brutal realities of Viking warfare and the sophisticated diplomatic world of Christian Europe. Sweyn Forkbeard, Canute's father, was already establishing himself as a formidable force in northern European politics by the time of his son's birth. Known for his distinctive forked beard that gave him his memorable epithet, Sweyn possessed the cunning of a seasoned diplomat and the ruthlessness of a Viking warrior. He had spent his youth consolidating power within Denmark, gradually building the naval strength and political alliances that would later enable his dramatic conquest of England. The identity of Canute's mother remains one of history's gentle mysteries. Wrapped in the complex web of medieval royal marriages and political alliances, the most widely accepted account suggests she was quite a Swawa, a daughter of Mieszko I of Poland, linking the young Danish prince to the emerging Polish state through blood ties that would prove valuable in future diplomatic endeavors. This Polish connection brought with it not only political advantages, but also exposure to a different model of medieval kingship, one that blended Slavic traditions with Christian governance. Alternative sources, particularly the rich tradition of Norse sagas, offer different possibilities for Canute's maternal lineage. Some chronicles suggest his mother may have been connected to Swedish royalty, possibly through the complex web of marriages that linked the Scandinavian royal houses. These varying accounts remind us that medieval record-keeping, while detailed, in many ways, often reflected the political needs of the chroniclers, rather than absolute historical truth. The Denmark of Canute's childhood was a realm caught between worlds. The old Viking traditions of raiding and conquest remained strong, yet the kingdom was simultaneously embracing the structures and ceremonies of Christian monarchy. Young Canute would have grown up witnessing this transformation firsthand, observing how his father and grandfather balanced the expectations of their warrior followers with the diplomatic necessities of dealing with Christian kings and ecclesiastical authorities. In the great halls of the Danish court, the boy would have listened to the songs of skalds, recounting the glorious deeds of Viking heroes, their voices weaving tales of battles fought beneath the northern lights and treasures won from distant shores. Yet he would also have seen Christian priests offering masses, watched as his grandfather built churches, and observed the careful protocols required when receiving envoys from the Holy Roman Empire or the kingdoms of France. This dual heritage, pagan warrior tradition and Christian political sophistication, would become one of Canute's greatest strengths as a ruler. Unlike many of his Viking contemporaries who struggled to adapt to the changing world of medieval Europe, Canute seemed instinctively to understand that true power lay not just in the strength of one's sword arm, but in the ability to inspire loyalty among diverse peoples and to command respect from both barbarian warriors and sophisticated courtiers. The physical description of Canute that has come down to us through the Icelandic sources paints a picture of a man who embodied this cultural duality. Described as exceptionally tall and strong, with keen eyes and a fine head of hair, he was said to be handsome in all respects, save for his nose, which was thin and rather hooked. This description, while written centuries later, suggests a figure who commanded attention through both physical presence and intellectual acuity. The training of a young Danish prince in the late 10th century encompassed far more than martial skills, though those were certainly central to the curriculum. Canute would have learned to handle sword and spear, to fight from both foot and horseback, and most importantly for a future naval commander, to navigate the treacherous waters of the North Sea and Baltic. The longship was as much a symbol of Danish power as any crown, and mastery of seamanship was essential for any ruler who hoped to maintain authority over the scattered islands and peninsulas of the Danish realm. But military training was only one aspect of Canute's education. He would also have learned the complex art of medieval diplomacy, studying the genealogies of royal houses, understanding the intricate web of alliances and enmities that shaped European politics, and mastering the protocols necessary for dealing with foreign courts. The ability to speak multiple languages, Old Norse, Latin, and probably some form of early English, would have been considered essential for a prince destined to rule over diverse populations. According to some sources, Canute may have received part of his military education under the guidance of Thorkel the Tall, one of the most renowned warriors of his generation and brother to Sigurd, Jarl of Jomsborg. The Vikings were an elite brotherhood of warriors based on the island of Wallin, off the coast of Pomerania, and their stronghold served as both a military base and a training ground for the finest fighters in the north. If these accounts are accurate, young Canute would have been exposed to the most advanced military tactics of his era, learning not just individual combat skills, but the complex art of commanding large forces in both land and naval battles. The influence of the Tall on Canute's development cannot be overstated. Thorkel represented the best of Viking military tradition, a warrior who combined personal courage with strategic brilliance, and who understood that successful warfare required not just bravery, but careful planning and diplomatic skill. Under such tutelage, Canute would have learned to think like a general, rather than merely a warrior, understanding how individual battles fit into larger campaigns and how military success needed to be consolidated through political means. As Canute matured through his teenage years, he would have begun to understand the complex challenges facing his father's generation of Scandinavian rulers. The old ways of Viking raiding were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain as the kingdoms of Western Europe grew stronger and more organized in their defenses. The future lay not in quick raids for plunder, but in the establishment of permanent territorial control and the creation of stable institutions that could govern diverse populations. Sweyn Forkbeard's own career provided a masterclass in this new approach to Viking expansion. Rather than simply raiding the English coast and withdrawing with whatever treasure could be quickly gathered, Sweyn had begun to envision the complete conquest and absorption of England into a greater Scandinavian empire. This vision required a fundamentally different approach to warfare and politics, one that emphasized long-term occupation rather than short-term gain. The young Canute would have observed his father's careful cultivation of alliances with other Scandinavian rulers, watching as Sweyn built the coalition of forces that would eventually enable the invasion of England. He would have seen how diplomatic marriages, shared military campaigns, and carefully negotiated treaties could create bonds of loyalty that mere force could never achieve. These lessons in coalition building would prove invaluable when Canute later faced the challenge of holding together his own multinational empire. Perhaps most importantly, Canute learned from his father's example the crucial importance of legitimacy in medieval kingship. Sweyn Forkbeard had not simply conquered Denmark through force. He had also worked tirelessly to present himself as the rightful heir to Danish royal tradition, emphasizing his descent from earlier kings and his role as protector of Danish customs and laws. This understanding of the symbolic and ceremonial aspects of kingship would later enable Canute to present himself not as a foreign conqueror but as a legitimate ruler in each of the kingdoms he controlled. The transition from sheltered prince to active warrior likely began for Canute in his early teens, when he first accompanied his father on the naval expeditions that were the lifeblood of Danish royal power. The exact date of his first voyage remains uncertain, but various sources suggest he may have participated in Sweyn's raids on England as early as 1003 or 1004, when he would have been perhaps 13 or 14 years old. These early expeditions served multiple purposes in young Canute's education. On the practical level, they provided invaluable experience in the realities of naval warfare and amphibious operations. The North Sea could be treacherous even for experienced mariners, and the ability to maintain fleet cohesion during storms, to coordinate complex landing operations on hostile shores, and to manage the logistics of keeping thousands of warriors fed and equipped during extended campaigns were skills that could only be learned through direct experience. The raids of 1003 and 1004 came in direct response to one of the most shocking events in Anglo-Saxon history, the St. Brice's Day Massacre of November 13th, 1002. On that day, King Tethelard the Unready had ordered the systematic killing of Danes living in England outside the traditional boundaries of the Danelh. This brutal act of ethnic cleansing had sent shockwaves throughout Scandinavia and provided Sweyn Forkbeard with both justification and motivation for renewed attacks on English soil. For young Canute, these retaliatory raids provided his first glimpse of the bitter hatred that could exist between different peoples, and the way in which acts of violence could echo across generations, creating cycles of revenge that shaped the destiny of kingdoms. The experience of seeing Danish settlements in England destroyed, of meeting refugees who had fled English persecution, and of witnessing his father's cold fury at these atrocities would have impressed upon the young prince the deadly seriousness of the ethnic and political conflicts that dominated medieval Europe. The campaigns of 1003 and 1004 also provided Canute with his first practical education in the complexities of medieval warfare. Viking raids were not the chaotic affairs of popular imagination, but carefully orchestrated military operations that required precise timing, detailed intelligence, and sophisticated logistical support. The success of these expeditions depended not just on the courage of individual warriors, but on the ability of commanders to coordinate the movements of dozens of ships carrying thousands of men across hundreds of miles of often hostile territory. Canute would have learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a coastal settlement was likely to be defended, how to identify the best landing sites for different types of vessels, and how to assess the military capabilities of potential opponents. The Vikings had developed an extensive intelligence network throughout England, maintained through merchants, mercenaries, and Danish settlers who could provide crucial information about English military preparations and political developments. The young prince would also have been introduced to the brutal realities of medieval combat. Viking warfare was intensely personal and viscerally violent, conducted at close quarters with weapons that required both skill and courage to wield effectively. The experience of seeing men killed and wounded in battle of participating in the terrifying chaos of a shield wall clash, and of dealing with the aftermath of victory and defeat would have marked the final transition from boyhood to warrior status. But perhaps most importantly, these early campaigns taught Canute about the psychological aspects of warfare that were often more crucial than mere military tactics. The reputation of Viking warriors for ferocity and ruthlessness was itself a weapon, often causing enemies to surrender without fighting, or to flee rather than face the prospect of battle. The cultivation and maintenance of this fearsome reputation required a careful balance between demonstrated mercy toward those who submitted voluntarily and implacable harshness toward those who offered resistance. As Canute's experience and reputation grew, he would have been given increasing responsibilities within his father's military organization. The structure of Viking forces was based on personal loyalty and proven competence rather than hereditary rank, and even a king's son needed to demonstrate his worthiness to command through successful performance in subordinate roles. The management of a Viking warband required skills that went far beyond military tactics. These were essentially floating cities, with thousands of men living in close quarters for weeks or months at a time. The prevention of conflicts between warriors from different regions, the fair distribution of plunder and supplies, the maintenance of discipline during long periods of inactivity, and the resolution of disputes that could easily escalate into blood feuds all required diplomatic skills of the highest order. Canute's natural abilities as a leader seemed to emerge during these early campaigns. Unlike many Viking commanders who led primarily through personal charisma and physical prowess, Canute appeared to possess an intuitive understanding of the complex motivations that drove different types of warriors. He could inspire Danish farmers with visions of English wealth, while simultaneously maintaining the loyalty of professional warriors who served for the love of battle itself. The young prince also demonstrated an early understanding of the importance of intelligence and preparation in military operations. While many of his contemporaries relied primarily on courage and superior weapons to achieve victory, Canute seemed to grasp that the most decisive battles were often won before the first sword was drawn. Through careful reconnaissance, diplomatic preparation, and the creation of favorable strategic conditions, the campaigns of the early 1000s also provided Canute with crucial experience in the complex diplomatic world of Scandinavian politics. Sweyn Forkbeard's expeditions against England were not purely Danish affairs, but coalition efforts that brought together warriors and ships from across the North Sea world. The management of these alliances required a deep understanding of the various political currents that flowed through Scandinavian society. Canute learned to navigate the intricate relationships between the various jarls and petty kings who controlled different regions of Norway, the complex web of family ties and ancient grudges that influenced Swedish politics, and the maritime trading networks that connected Scandinavian merchants with markets from Greenland to Constantinople. This broad perspective on Northern European affairs would later prove invaluable when he faced the challenge of creating a unified empire from the diverse territories he conquered. The young prince also began to develop his own network of personal followers and allies during these years. The warrior culture of the Vikings placed enormous emphasis on personal loyalty between leaders and their followers, and the bonds forged in the shared dangers and triumphs of military campaigns often lasted for life. Canute's ability to inspire this kind of devotion among warriors from diverse backgrounds would become one of his greatest assets as a ruler. Perhaps most significantly, these early campaigns taught Canute about the changing nature of warfare and politics in medieval Europe. The old Viking model of quick raids, followed by rapid withdrawal, was becoming increasingly obsolete as the kingdoms of Western Europe developed more effective defensive systems and standing armies. The future belonged to rulers who could establish permanent territorial control and create stable institutions capable of governing large populations over extended periods. By 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard had concluded that the time had come for a definitive assault on England, one designed not merely to extract tribute, but to achieve complete political control. The preparation for this great invasion represented the culmination of years of careful planning, diplomatic negotiation, and military preparation. For Canute, now a young man of perhaps 23 years, this campaign would provide his first experience of warfare on a truly grand scale. The invasion fleet that assembled in Danish harbors during the summer of 1013 was unlike anything that had been seen in northern European waters for generations. Contemporary sources suggest that Sweyn commanded hundreds of ships carrying thousands of warriors, representing not just the military might of Denmark, but also contingents from Norway, Sweden, and various Slavic territories. The logistics of organizing such a massive expedition was staggering, requiring months of advanced preparation and the coordination of resources from across the Scandinavian world. Canute's role in these preparations would have been substantial, though the exact nature of his responsibilities remains unclear from the surviving sources. As Sweyn's eldest son and designated heir, he would certainly have been involved in the high-level planning sessions that determined the expeditions, strategic objectives, and tactical approaches. More importantly, he would have gained invaluable experience in the complex art of coalition management, learning how to balance the sometimes conflicting interests of different allied groups, while maintaining overall unity of purpose. The intelligence gathering that preceded the invasion was particularly sophisticated, reflecting the extent to which Viking expeditions had evolved beyond simple raiding parties. Sweyn's agents in England provided detailed information about the political situation in different regions, the military capabilities of various English lords, and the state of fortifications at key strategic points. This intelligence network had been developed over years of smaller raids and diplomatic contacts, creating a web of informants and sympathizers that extended throughout English society. The choice of 1013 for the Great Invasion was not accidental, but reflected careful analysis of English political weakness. King Tellard, the Unready, had spent much of the previous decade dealing with internal rebellions and external threats, gradually losing the support of many of his nobles through a combination of military failures and increasingly erratic policies. The English treasury had been drained by years of tribute payments to earlier Danish raiders, and the kingdom's military forces were demoralized by repeated defeats. The invasion began in earnest during late summer 1013, with Sweyn's fleet making its first major landing in the Humber estuary. This choice of landing site was strategically brilliant, placing the Danish forces in the heart of the old Daniola, where they could expect to find substantial numbers of people with Danish ancestry who might be sympathetic to their cause. The psychological impact of this landing was immediate and profound, signaling to the English population that this was not merely another raid, but the beginning of a systematic conquest. Canute's specific role during the initial landing operations demonstrates the trust that his father placed in his military abilities, while Sweyn himself led the main force inland toward the major English cities. Canute was given command of the fleet and the crucial responsibility of maintaining the expedition's base at Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. This assignment was far more significant than it might initially appear, as control of the fleet represented the expedition's lifeline to Denmark and the guarantee of retreat if the campaign encountered serious difficulties. The Danish advance through England proceeded with remarkable speed and efficiency. Town after town submitted to Sweyn's forces without serious resistance, as news of the invasion spread faster than the Danish army itself. The psychological warfare that preceded the physical conquest was particularly effective, with carefully spread rumors of Danish military might and promises of fair treatment for those who submitted voluntarily, convincing many English communities to abandon resistance before any battles were fought. The rapid collapse of English resistance can be attributed to several factors beyond simple Danish military superiority. The Ethelred's repeated failures as a military leader had undermined confidence in royal leadership, while his harsh taxation policies and arbitrary treatment of his nobles had alienated many potential supporters. Perhaps most importantly, the memory of earlier Danish rule in much of northern and eastern England meant that many inhabitants viewed the invasion not as foreign conquest, but as the restoration of a familiar political order. For Canute, observing these events from his base at Gainsborough, the campaign provided crucial lessons in the relationship between military force and political legitimacy. The most decisive victories were achieved not through bloody battles, but through the careful cultivation of local support and the demonstration that Danish rule could provide stability and prosperity. These insights would later influence his own approach to governance when he became king. By winter 1013, the Danish conquest of England was essentially complete. Theled the Unready had fled to Normandy with his immediate family, seeking refuge with his wife's relatives at the Norman court. The English nobility, faced with the choice between continued resistance and accommodation with the new reality, had largely chosen submission. Sweyn Forkbeard was acknowledged as King of England, marking the first time since the Anglo-Saxon settlement that the country had fallen under foreign rule. The speed and completeness of this victory exceeded even the most optimistic Danish expectations. What had been planned as a multi-year campaign of gradual conquest had been achieved in a matter of months, with relatively little bloodshed and minimal destruction of the kingdom's economic resources. For medieval standards, this represented warfare at its most efficient and effective, demonstrating the evolution of Viking military strategy from simple raiding to sophisticated conquest and occupation. Canute's position during these triumphant months was both privileged and educational. As the designated heir to his father's newfound English throne, he was able to observe firsthand the complex process of transitioning from military conquest to political administration. The establishment of Danish authority over English institutions, the integration of English nobles into the new regime, and the delicate balance between rewarding Danish supporters and maintaining English cooperation all provided invaluable lessons. In the art of ruling conquered territories, the young prince also had the opportunity to study English society and government from the inside, gaining insights that would prove crucial during his own later reign. The sophistication of English administrative systems, the wealth generated by English agriculture and trade, and the complex relationships between different social classes all represented new models that differed significantly from Scandinavian traditions. This exposure to alternative approaches to governance would later enable Canute to create innovative solutions to the challenges of ruling diverse populations. The winter of 1013 to 1014 represented the high point of Sweyn Forkbeard's career, and the apparent fulfillment of his long-cherished ambitions for English conquest. The establishment of winter quarters throughout England allowed the Danish forces to rest and consolidate their gains while planning for the administrative challenges of permanent occupation. For Canute, this period of apparent triumph provided both celebration and preparation for the responsibilities that seemed likely to fall upon him in the near future. However, even during these months of triumph, careful observers might have noticed certain warning signs about the long-term sustainability of Danish rule in England. The speed of the conquest, while impressive from a military standpoint, had not allowed sufficient time for the deep political and cultural changes that would be necessary for permanent integration. English submission had been largely pragmatic, rather than heartfelt, based on recognition of Danish military superiority, rather than genuine acceptance of Danish legitimacy. Canute, with his keen intelligence and political sensitivity, likely recognized some of these potential problems, even during the height of Danish success. The maintenance of large military forces was expensive and required constant attention to logistics and supply. The integration of English and Danish administrative systems posed complex, technical challenges that would require years to resolve fully. Most importantly, the question of succession and long-term political stability remained unresolved, as Sweyn's authority rested primarily on personal charisma and military success rather than established institutional foundations. The experience of governing England during these months also highlighted for Canute the fundamental differences between ruling through conquest and ruling through consent. While Danish military power could certainly compel obedience, the creation of genuine loyalty and long-term stability would require a much more sophisticated approach to leadership. The lessons learned during this period would later influence Canute's decision to present himself as a legitimate English king rather than merely a successful foreign conqueror. For a young man who had grown up expecting to inherit the Danish throne, the prospect of ruling England as well represented both tremendous opportunity and daunting responsibility. The potential wealth and power that came with English rule were obvious, but so too were the challenges of maintaining control over a large, sophisticated kingdom with its own deeply rooted traditions and institutions. The winter of 1013 to 1014 thus marked not just the triumph of Danish arms, but also the beginning of Canute's serious preparation for the complex art of medieval kingship. The triumph of Danish conquest in England came to an abrupt and shocking end. On February 3rd, 1014, when Sweyn Forkbeard died suddenly at Gainsborough, the very base where he had left his son Canute in command of the Danish fleet. The death was unexpected and catastrophic for Danish hopes, striking down the architect of conquest at the moment of his greatest success. For Canute, the loss was both personal and political, eliminating not only his beloved father, but also the central figure whose authority had held together the complex coalition of forces that had achieved the English conquest. The circumstances of Sweyn's death remain mysterious, with various sources offering different explanations ranging from illness to divine judgment. Some English chronicles, written with obvious bias, suggested that the Danish king had been struck down by God as punishment for his seizure of Christian England. More neutral sources simply record his sudden demise without speculating about supernatural causes. For Canute, the exact cause of his father's death was less important than its immediate and devastating political consequences. The impact of Sweyn's death reverberated throughout both England and Scandinavia with lightning speed. In Denmark, Canute's older brother Harold immediately claimed the throne, following Scandinavian traditions that did not automatically recognize the rights of a younger brother, even one who had been designated as heir to conquered territories. In England, news of the Danish king's death provided immediate hope to those who had submitted reluctantly to foreign rule and galvanized support for the restoration of the native dynasty. For Canute personally, his father's death marked the end of his apprenticeship and the beginning of his independent political career under the most challenging possible circumstances. At approximately 24 years of age, he suddenly found himself responsible for maintaining Danish control over England without the benefit of his father's reputation, established authority, or presence to provide guidance and support. The magnitude of this challenge would have tested even the most experienced leader, and for a young man who had never held independent command, the situation was truly daunting. The English response to Sweyn's death was swift and decisive, demonstrating that the apparent submission of 1013 had been more pragmatic than genuine. Within weeks of receiving news of the Danish king's demise, a delegation of English nobles had crossed the Channel to Normandy, where they formally invited Teledde unready to return to his throne. This invitation came with conditions. The English demanded promises of better governance and more respectful treatment, but it represented a clear rejection of Danish rule and a reaffirmation of English political independence. Ethelred's return to England was accomplished with remarkable speed and efficiency, suggesting that preparations for this possibility had been underway even during the period of Danish dominance. The deposed king brought with him not only Norman support, but also a clear political program designed to rally English opposition to the Danish occupation. Promises of pardons for those who had collaborated with the invaders, combined with appeals to English patriotism and Christian identity, proved highly effective in mobilizing resistance. The political transformation of England following Eldred's return was almost as rapid as the original Danish conquest had been. Communities that had submitted to Sweyn now declared their loyalty to the restored English king, while Danish garrisons found themselves isolated and increasingly vulnerable to local hostility. The psychological momentum that had favored the invaders was suddenly reversed, with English confidence rising as Danish prospects dimmed. For Canute, the challenge was not merely military, but fundamentally political. His forces remained formidable in purely tactical terms, but they were now operating in an increasingly hostile environment where local support could no longer be assumed. The elaborate intelligence networks that had supported his father's conquest began to collapse as English informants switched sides or simply disappeared. Supply lines became precarious, and the prospect of reinforcement from Denmark grew. Uncertain with Harold's assumption of the Danish throne, the final collapse of Danish authority in England came with dramatic suddenness. Tellard, emboldened by the rapid shift in political momentum, led a direct attack on the Danish base at Gainsborough. Canute, despite his military training and natural courage, found himself in an impossible strategic position. His forces, while still substantial, were insufficient to hold territory against a resurgent English kingdom backed by popular support. The choice faced was stark: fight a hopeless battle that would likely result in the destruction of the Danish army, or conduct a strategic withdrawal that would preserve forces for future campaigns. Canute chose retreat, but the manner of his withdrawal would haunt his reputation for years to come. As the Danish fleet prepared to depart English shores, Canute ordered the mutilation of English hostages who had been taken during his father's conquest. Hands, noses, and ears were cut off before the unfortunate prisoners were put ashore at Sandwich in Kent, creating a horrific spectacle that served both as a warning to future opponents and as an expression of Danish fury at their unexpected reversal of fortune. This act of brutal vengeance was both strategically foolish and morally reprehensible, demonstrating that the young Canute had not yet learned the subtle arts of political calculation that his later career would exemplify. The mutilation of hostages served no practical military purpose and indeed undermined Danish prospects for future campaigns by providing English propaganda with powerful evidence of Danish barbarism. For a leader who would later become renowned for his political sophistication and diplomatic skill, this early decision represented a significant failure of judgment. The journey back to Denmark was a sobering experience for Canute and his followers. What had begun as a triumphant expedition of conquest had ended in ignominious defeat, with nothing to show for months of effort except the bitter taste of failure and the knowledge that their enemies now held the initiative. The contrast between the confident invasion force that had sailed from Denmark in 1013 and the demoralized remnants that returned in 1014 was stark and painful. The period following Canute's return to Denmark was crucial for his political and personal development. The failure in England had demonstrated both his own limitations as a leader and the fundamental challenges involved in conquering and holding distant territories. The experience had been humbling, but it had also been educational, providing lessons that would prove invaluable during his later, more successful campaigns. During the months following his retreat from England, Canute appears to have engaged in serious reflection about the strategic and tactical mistakes that had led to Danish defeat. The rapidity of English recovery following Sweyn's death had highlighted the importance of establishing deep roots of legitimacy rather than relying solely on military superiority. The collapse of Danish support networks had demonstrated the need for more sophisticated intelligence and political operations. Most importantly, the political isolation that had doomed the Danish occupation had shown the crucial importance of building sustainable alliances and maintaining popular support. The young Danish prince also had to navigate the complex political situation within Scandinavia following his father's death. His brother Harald's assumption of the Danish throne was legitimate according to traditional succession practices, but it left Canute in an ambiguous position regarding his own political future. The territories that Sweyn had conquered were no longer under Danish control, and Canute's status as heir to English claims was now more theoretical than practical. However, this period of apparent defeat and uncertainty also provided Canute with important opportunities for political growth and strategic planning. Free from the immediate pressures of governing conquered territories, he could focus on building the alliances, resources, and military capabilities that would be necessary for future campaigns. The lessons learned from failure, combined with his natural intelligence and political instincts, would ultimately prove more valuable than easy victory might have been. The retreat from England in 1014 marked the end of Canute's apprenticeship as a Viking warrior and the beginning of his transformation into one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated political leaders. The humiliation of defeat had been painful, but it had also been formative, teaching lessons about the relationship between force and legitimacy that would shape his approach to power for the rest of his career. The young man who had fled England in disgrace would return within 2 years as a conqueror, whose political skills matched his military prowess, ready to build an empire that would endure for a generation. As we drift towards sleep, we can imagine the young Canute standing on the deck of his longship as the English coast disappeared behind him, already planning his return to the land that had rejected his father's rule but would soon accept his own. The making of a Viking king was complete, but the making of a great king was just beginning. The year 1015 dawned cold and grey across the North Sea, but in the halls of Danish warriors, a different kind of fire burned a flame of vengeance and renewed ambition. Canute, no longer the untested prince who had fled England in humiliation, the previous year had spent the intervening months transforming both himself and his capabilities for war. The young man who returned to English shores would prove to be a fundamentally different kind of conqueror than his father had been, one who understood that lasting victory required not just military triumph, but political wisdom and the delicate art of winning hearts as well as battles. The preparation for Canute's second invasion of England began almost immediately after his retreat from Gainsborough, but this time the planning was fundamentally different in scope and sophistication. Where Sweyn Forkbeard's expedition had relied primarily on Danish resources and traditional Viking allies, Canute set about creating a truly international coalition that would bring together warriors and ships from across the known world. This ambitious diplomatic campaign demonstrated the young prince's growing understanding that the conquest of England would require resources beyond those available to any single Scandinavian kingdom. The centerpiece of this coalition-building effort was Canute's relationship with Bolsois the Brave. the powerful Duke of Poland, who would later become that country's first crowned king. This alliance was both practical and personal, building upon the family connections established through Canut's Polish mother, while also addressing the strategic needs of both rulers. Boleswar provided not only Polish troops for the invasion, but also crucial financial support and logistical assistance, transforming what might have been a purely Scandinavian enterprise into a broader European venture. The inclusion of Polish forces in the invasion army was particularly significant, for several reasons. Polish warriors brought different tactical approaches and equipment than their Scandinavian counterparts, adding versatility to Canut's military options. More importantly, the presence of Polish troops sent a clear political message about the international scope of Canut's ambitions and the legitimacy of his claims to English rule. This was not merely another Viking raid, but a serious attempt at dynastic conquest backed by multiple European powers. Swedish participation in the expedition was secured through careful negotiation with King Olof Skadkonen, whose kingdom represented one of the major military powers of Northern Europe. The Swedish alliance was particularly valuable because it provided access to the extensive trading networks and shipbuilding capabilities that Sweden had developed throughout the Baltic region. Swedish longships were renowned for their speed and seaworthiness, while Swedish warriors brought with them generations of experience in both naval and land warfare. Norwegian involvement was more complex, reflecting the divided political situation within that kingdom. Erik Hakanarsson, the Earl of Lade, who served as Kurula of Norway alongside his brother, brought substantial Norwegian forces to Canut's cause. This participation was motivated partly by personal loyalty to the Danish royal house and partly by strategic calculation about the benefits of supporting a successful conquest. The inclusion of Norwegian jarls and their followers added both military strength and political legitimacy to the expedition, demonstrating that Canut's invasion enjoyed broad Scandinavian support. The logistics of assembling the invasion fleet were staggering in their complexity and scope. Contemporary sources suggest that Canute ultimately commanded more than 200 ships, carrying perhaps 10,000 warriors, making this one of the largest military expeditions in Northern European history. Up to that time, the coordination required to bring together such a massive force from multiple kingdoms, ensure adequate supplies for an extended campaign, and maintain unity of command across diverse military traditions represented a masterpiece of medieval military organization. The ships themselves represented the cutting edge of medieval naval technology, ranging from sleek longships designed for speed and maneuverability to larger vessels capable of carrying substantial numbers of troops and supplies. The famous description from the Encomium MA provides a glimpse of the splendor and intimidation these vessels were designed to project. Golden prows gleaming in the sunlight, shields arrayed along the gunwales in brilliant displays of color, and carved figureheads that seemed to snarl defiance at any who might oppose them. Each ship represented not just a vessel, but a complete military unit with its own internal hierarchy, traditions, and loyalties. The challenge of welding these diverse groups into a unified fighting force required diplomatic skills as sophisticated as any purely military capabilities. Canut's success in maintaining coalition unity throughout the extended campaign that followed demonstrated his remarkable growth as a leader since his earlier, less successful expedition. The intelligence preparation for the invasion was also far more sophisticated than in previous Viking expeditions. Canut's agents had spent months gathering detailed information about English political conditions, military capabilities, and potential sources of support or opposition. This intelligence network included merchants who traded regularly between Scandinavia and England, Danish settlers who had remained in England following earlier waves of migration, and even English nobles who had become disaffected with Lelred's rule. The invasion fleet made its landfall in Wessex during the late summer of 1015, selecting a landing site that demonstrated both tactical acumen and political awareness, rather than returning to the Humber estuary where his father had achieved initial success. Canute chose to strike directly at the heart of traditional English royal power in the southern kingdoms. This bold decision signaled his intention to achieve complete conquest rather than merely establishing control over the traditionally Danish regions of northern England. The choice of Wessex as the initial target was strategically brilliant for several reasons. This region represented the ancient heartland of English royal power, the kingdom from which Alfred the Great and his successors had driven back earlier waves of Viking invasion. By striking directly at Wessex, Canute was making a clear statement about his ultimate objectives, while also placing maximum pressure on the English royal house at its most vulnerable point. The initial landing operations proceeded with remarkable efficiency, demonstrating the extent to which Canute had learned from his earlier experiences. Rather than simply beaching his ships and immediately pushing inland, the Danish forces took time to establish secure bases, organize supply lines, and gather intelligence about local conditions. This methodical approach reflected a more mature understanding of the challenges involved in sustaining military operations in potentially hostile territory. The psychological impact of the invasion was immediate and profound. Word of the Danish landing spread rapidly throughout England, carrying with it memories of Sweyn Forkbeard's earlier conquest and the chaos that had followed. Many English communities, remembering the rapid collapse of resistance in 1013, began to consider the wisdom of early submission rather than futile resistance. This psychological warfare was perhaps as valuable as any purely military advantage that Canute's forces possessed. The early success of Danish operations in Wessex can be attributed not only to military superiority but also to the careful political preparation that had preceded the invasion. Canute's agents had worked to identify potential supporters among the English nobility, particularly those who had grown disenchanted with Lelred's increasingly erratic rule. The promise of continuity in local governance for those who submitted early proved highly effective in reducing resistance and speeding the pace of conquest. One of the most significant early developments in the campaign was the defection of Edric Striana, the powerful alderman of Mercia, who brought with him not only his own substantial forces but also crucial knowledge of English military plans and political conditions. Edric's change of allegiance represented a devastating blow to English hopes of coordinated resistance and provided Canute with both military reinforcement and political legitimacy within English society. The reasons for Edric's defection were complex, reflecting both personal ambition and practical calculation about the likely outcome of the conflict. As one of the most powerful nobles in England, Edric had everything to lose from backing the wrong side in what was clearly going to be a decisive struggle for royal control. His intimate knowledge of Ethelred's weaknesses, combined with his assessment of Canute's military capabilities, likely convinced him that Danish victory was inevitable, and that early submission would secure better terms than stubborn resistance. Edric's defection was accompanied by that of Thorkel the Tall, the renowned Viking warrior who had previously served English interests but now returned to his Scandinavian loyalties. Thorkel's change of sides was particularly significant because of his military reputation and his detailed knowledge of English defensive preparations. His presence in Canute's camp provided both strategic expertise and a powerful symbol of Scandinavian unity in support of the invasion. The combination of Edric and Thorkel's forces with Canute's invasion army created a military machine of unprecedented power and versatility. The diverse composition of this coalition forced Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, Polish, and now English troops required sophisticated command structures and careful attention to maintaining unity of purpose despite cultural and linguistic differences. Canut's success in managing this complex alliance demonstrated his remarkable growth as both a military commander and a political leader. The rapid submission of much of Wessex to Danish authority followed patterns established during Sweyn's earlier conquest, but with important differences that reflected Canut's more sophisticated approach to occupation and governance. Rather than simply imposing Danish rule through military force, Canute made careful efforts to present himself as a legitimate claimant to English royal authority, emphasizing his connections to earlier Danish rulers and his commitment to maintaining traditional English laws and customs. As Danish forces consolidated their control over much of southern England, a formidable opponent emerged to challenge Canut's path to complete conquest. Edmund Ironside, the eldest surviving son of Tillard the Unready, possessed both the royal bloodline necessary for legitimate resistance and the personal courage required to rally English opposition to foreign rule. Unlike his father, whose military failures had contributed to the collapse of English resistance in previous conflicts, Edmund demonstrated from the beginning a warrior's temperament and a strategic mind that would make him one of the most dangerous opponents Canute would ever face. Edmund's nickname Ironside reflected not only his personal courage in battle, but also his unwavering determination to resist Danish conquest regardless of the odds against him. This combination of royal legitimacy and proven military capability made him a natural focal point for English resistance, providing a viable alternative to submission that many nobles had been seeking. The emergence of Edmund as a serious rival transformed what might have been a relatively straightforward conquest into a prolonged and bloody struggle for supremacy. The political situation within England during this period was extraordinarily complex, with loyalties shifting rapidly as different nobles calculated the likely outcomes of the escalating conflict. Aelfred's death in April 1016 removed one source of potential unity for English resistance, while simultaneously clarifying the dynastic stakes involved in the struggle. Edmund's claim to the throne was legitimate according to traditional English succession practices, but it had to be balanced against the practical reality of Danish military superiority and the growing momentum of Canut's conquest. The division of English political sentiment was dramatically illustrated by the simultaneous assemblies that met to choose Aelfred's successor. In London, the citizens and those nobles present declared for Edmund, recognizing his legitimate claim and his demonstrated military capabilities. However, at Southampton, a larger assembly of nobles declared their support for Canute, reflecting both their assessment of military realities and their desire to position themselves favorably with what appeared to be the likely victor. This political division created a complex, strategic situation in which both claimants could legitimately claim royal authority while neither possessed undisputed control over the entire kingdom. For Edmund, the challenge was to transform his legitimate claim into practical military control before Danish forces could complete their conquest. For Canute, the existence of a viable rival claimant meant that military victory alone would not be sufficient. He would also need to achieve political legitimacy and popular acceptance to secure his position. The military campaign that developed between Edmund and Canute represented warfare at its most sophisticated and deadly, combining traditional Viking tactical approaches with the more complex strategic requirements of territorial conquest and defense. Both commanders possessed substantial military capabilities and demonstrated throughout the conflict a level of strategic thinking that elevated their struggle far above the simple raids and counter-raids that had characterized earlier conflicts. Edmund's initial strategy focused on consolidating English resistance in the traditional strongholds of royal power, while simultaneously attempting to disrupt Danish supply lines and communications. His intimate knowledge of English geography and political conditions provided significant advantages in planning defensive operations, while his royal status enabled him to call upon traditional loyalties and obligations that Canute, as a foreign invader, could not access. The English resistance strategy also relied heavily on the hope of foreign assistance, particularly from Normandy, where Edmund's half-brothers had taken refuge during the Danish conquest. The possibility of Norman intervention on behalf of the legitimate English royal house represented a constant threat to Danish plans and required Canute to maintain substantial forces in defensive positions rather than concentrating everything on offensive operations. Canute's strategic approach during this period demonstrated the sophistication, understanding of warfare and politics that would characterize his entire career. Rather than simply pursuing Edmund's forces in direct confrontation, he focused on systematically reducing English strongholds, while simultaneously working to undermine Edmund's political support through a combination of diplomatic pressure and military intimidation. The Danish strategy also emphasized the importance of maintaining control over key strategic points, particularly London, whose wealth and symbolic importance made it crucial to any claim to English royal authority. The prolonged siege operations that developed around London demonstrated both the sophistication of medieval siege warfare and the determination of both sides to achieve decisive results rather than accepting a stalemate. One of the most challenging aspects of the conflict for both commanders was the fluid nature of medieval political loyalties, which could shift rapidly based on changing assessments of military success and political advantage. The case of Edric Strena provides the most dramatic example of these shifting allegiances, as the Mercian alderman changed sides multiple times during the course of the conflict, each time bringing with him substantial military forces and crucial strategic intelligence. Edric's complex role in the conflict highlights the extent to which medieval warfare was as much about political maneuvering as military tactics. His initial defection to Canute had provided the Danish forces with crucial reinforcements and local knowledge, but his subsequent return to English allegiance suggested either a change in his assessment of likely outcomes or a more complex game of hedging bets to ensure survival regardless of the final result. The management of these shifting allegiances required both Edmund and Canute to demonstrate not only military skill but also sophisticated understanding of the motivations and fears that drove medieval noble behavior. Trust became a precious commodity in a conflict where today's ally might become tomorrow's enemy, and both commanders had to balance the practical need for military support against the risks of relying too heavily on potentially unreliable allies. The international dimension of the conflict also complicated the loyalty calculations of various participants. The involvement of Polish, Swedish, and Norwegian forces in Canute's army created opportunities for some English nobles to position themselves as defenders of English independence against foreign domination, while also creating incentives for others to seek accommodation with what appeared to be an inevitable Danish victory backed by broad international support for ordinary English subjects. The shifting fortunes of war and the complex web of competing loyalties created an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that influenced the course of military operations. Communities that had initially submitted to Danish authority might rebel if Edmund's forces appeared in the area, while regions that had declared for Edmund might surrender if faced with the approach of Danish armies. This volatility made the control of territory exceptionally difficult for both sides and contributed to the prolonged and bloody nature of the conflict. The first major confrontations between Edmund and Canute's forces took place at Penselwood in Somerset and Shurston in Wiltshire, battles that established the pattern of bloody but inconclusive engagements that would characterize much of the conflict. These encounters were significant not merely for their immediate tactical results, but for what they revealed about the military capabilities and strategic approaches of both commanders. The Battle of Penselwood was fought in the dense woodlands of Selwood Forest, terrain that favored the defensive tactics that Edmund had adopted throughout his campaign. The location itself was symbolically significant, as this ancient forest had served as a refuge for English resistance during Alfred the Great's struggles against earlier Danish invasions. Edmund's choice to make a stand in this historically resonant location sent a clear message about his determination to continue the traditions of English resistance regardless of the odds against him. The tactical details of the Penselwood engagement demonstrate the evolution of early medieval warfare beyond the simple shield wall confrontations of earlier eras. Both armies employed sophisticated combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, cavalry, and missile troops in complex tactical formations. The dense forest terrain required adaptations to traditional Viking battle tactics, forcing Canut's forces to fight in smaller, more dispersed units rather than the massive formations that had proven effective in more open terrain. The battle's inconclusive outcome reflected the fundamental military balance between the two forces. Edmund's troops fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland, while Canut's warriors possessed the confidence and experience of recent victories. Neither side was able to achieve a decisive advantage, resulting in heavy casualties for both armies without resolving the larger strategic questions at stake in the conflict. The subsequent engagement at Assandun was even more intense and prolonged, lasting for 2 full days of brutal combat that left both armies exhausted and depleted. The extended duration of this battle was unusual for medieval warfare, which typically saw conflicts resolved within a few hours due to the physical exhaustion of warriors fighting in heavy armor and the difficulty of maintaining tactical coordination. Over extended periods, the 2-day struggle at Assandun became legendary among contemporary chroniclers for the ferocity of the fighting and the personal courage displayed by warriors on both sides. Edmund himself fought in the front ranks of his forces, inspiring his men through personal example while risking the disaster that would follow if he were killed or captured. Canute, while perhaps more cautious about exposing himself to personal danger, nevertheless demonstrated the leadership qualities that would later make him one of Europe's most successful kings. The prolonged siege of London represented one of the most sophisticated military operations of the early medieval period, demonstrating the extent to which warfare had evolved beyond simple field battles to encompass complex engineering, logistics, and naval operations. London's strategic importance made it essential for both Edmund and Canute to control, as the city represented not only enormous wealth, but also the symbolic heart of English royal authority. Canute's approach to the siege demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of combined arms warfare that characterized his entire military career. Rather than simply surrounding the city and waiting for starvation to force surrender, Danish forces constructed elaborate siege works that included dikes on both the northern and southern approaches to the city and a remarkable channel dug across the Thames to allow Danish longships to bypass London Bridge and cut off river communications. The engineering achievement represented by these siege works was extraordinary for its time, requiring the coordination of thousands of workers and the movement of enormous quantities of earth and stone. The construction of the Thames bypass channel was particularly ambitious, as it required sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering and careful coordination with tidal patterns to ensure that Danish ships could navigate the artificial waterway safely. The siege also featured naval warfare of unprecedented complexity, as both sides employed fleets of warships to contest control of the Thames and its tributaries. The Danish fleet, with its superior numbers and more advanced naval technology, initially dominated these engagements, but Edmund's forces proved resourceful in developing innovative tactics that partially offset their numerical disadvantage. The psychological warfare that accompanied the siege was as important as the purely military operations. Both sides recognized that the symbolic significance of London made its control crucial for any claim to legitimate royal authority. For Edmund, successful defense of the city would demonstrate his ability to protect English interests against foreign aggression, while for Canute, its capture would provide dramatic proof of Danish superiority and his own fitness to rule. The Battle of Brentford stands out in the record of Edmund and Canute's conflict as one of the few clear tactical victories achieved by English forces, demonstrating that Danish military superiority was not absolute and providing crucial encouragement to English resistance at a critical moment in the campaign. The engagement also highlighted Edmund's personal courage and tactical skill, establishing his reputation as a worthy opponent who could match Canute in both strategic thinking and battlefield leadership. The battle emerged from Edmund's successful relief of the London siege, an operation that required careful coordination between the city's defenders and relieving forces approaching from the west. The complexity of this maneuver demonstrated the sophisticated level of military planning that English forces had achieved despite their generally defensive posture throughout the conflict. Edmund's ability to break through Danish siege lines and temporarily lift the pressure on London provided a much-needed boost to English morale. The engagement at Brentford itself was fought under conditions that favored English tactical approaches, with the river crossing providing a natural defensive position that limited Danish numerical advantages. Edmund's forces were able to occupy strong defensive positions on the southern bank of the Thames, while forcing Canute's army to attempt a difficult river crossing under hostile fire. This tactical situation played to English strengths while minimizing the effectiveness of Danish cavalry and the superior mobility that had characterized much of their earlier success. The battle demonstrated Edmund's growing skill as a battlefield commander as he successfully coordinated defensive positions, managed reserve forces, and maintained tactical unity during the chaos of medieval combat. His personal participation in the fighting, while dangerous, provided crucial inspiration to English troops who had grown accustomed to defeats and retreats. The sight of their legitimate king standing firm against foreign invaders rekindled the spirit of resistance that had been gradually eroding throughout the Danish campaign. However, Edmund's tactical victory at Brentford came at a substantial cost in casualties that English forces could ill afford. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that many English warriors were lost, either in the battle itself or through drowning during the river-crossing operations that followed. This heavy price for victory highlighted the fundamental strategic problem facing English resistance. Even successful battles were depleting irreplaceable manpower faster than victories could be achieved. The aftermath of Brentford demonstrated both the temporary benefits and ultimate limitations of Edmund's tactical success. While the victory provided a crucial boost to English morale and temporarily disrupted Danish operational planning, it did not fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the conflict. Canute's forces remained superior in numbers, equipment, and international support, while Edmund's army, despite its recent success, continued to face the challenge of sustaining resistance with limited resources and uncertain political support. The Battle of Assandun, fought on October 18, 1016, represented the climactic engagement of the entire Anglo-Danish conflict, determining not only the immediate outcome of the war between Edmund and Canute, but also the future direction of English political development for generations to come. The battle's location, probably somewhere in Essex, though the exact site remains disputed, placed it at the strategic heart of England, where the ancient kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia met the Danish-influenced regions of East Anglia. The approach to battle demonstrated the sophisticated military planning that both commanders had developed throughout their prolonged conflict. Canut's forces, despite their recent setback at Brentford, maintained their overall strategic advantages in numbers, equipment, and logistical support. The Danish army that advanced to meet Edmund represented the culmination of months of careful preparation, international alliance building, and tactical refinement based on lessons learned from earlier engagements. Edmund's army, while smaller and less well-equipped than its Danish counterpart, possessed the advantages of desperate courage and intimate knowledge of local terrain. The English forces also benefited from the unified command structure that Edmund had gradually imposed on the various regional levies and noble contingents that made up his army. This unity of command had been one of Edmund's greatest achievements. As a military leader, overcoming the traditional fragmentation that had plagued English resistance efforts in previous conflicts, the tactical deployment for the battle reflected the different strategic approaches that had characterized each army. Throughout the campaign, Edmund arranged his forces in the traditional three-line formation that had served English armies well in previous engagements, personally taking position in the front ranks where his presence would provide maximum inspiration to his troops. This deployment emphasized English determination and personal courage, while accepting the risks that came with exposing royal leadership to the chaos of medieval combat. Canut's tactical approach was more sophisticated and cautious, reflecting his growth as a military commander since his earlier, less successful campaigns. Rather than personally leading charges, as many Viking commanders traditionally did, Canute positioned himself where he could maintain overall tactical control while delegating frontline leadership to experienced subordinates like Thorkel the Tall and Eirika Hakanason. This approach demonstrated the evolution of medieval military leadership toward more complex command structures that emphasized strategic oversight rather than personal heroics. The crucial moment in the battle came when Edric Striona, fighting alongside Edmund despite his earlier defections, suddenly withdrew his Mercian forces from the battle line. Whether this withdrawal represented treachery, cowardice, or genuine tactical concerns remains debated by historians, but its immediate effect was catastrophic for English prospects. The gap created by the Mercian withdrawal allowed Danish forces to break through English lines and transform what had been a closely contested engagement into a decisive Danish victory. The collapse of English resistance following Edric's withdrawal was swift and complete, with Edmund's army suffering catastrophic casualties that effectively ended organized English opposition to Danish conquest. Among the notable casualties was Ulfsitel, the leading Thane whose death symbolized the destruction of the English warrior class that had sustained resistance throughout the conflict. The loss of such experienced military leaders represented a blow from which English resistance would never recover. In the aftermath of the devastating defeat at Assandun, Edmund Ironside faced the bitter reality that continued resistance would likely result in the complete destruction of English royal authority and the potential elimination of the native dynasty entirely. The pragmatic decision to seek terms with Canute, while painful for a warrior who had never known defeat before this campaign, represented a mature recognition of political and military realities that preserved at least some hope for English survival. Under Danish rule, the negotiations that led to the Treaty of Alney took place on a small island in the River Severn, a location chosen for its symbolic neutrality and practical security for both parties. The choice of venue reflected the careful attention to diplomatic protocol that would characterize Canute's approach to governance throughout his reign. By meeting Edmund on neutral ground rather than demanding submission at a Danish stronghold, Canute demonstrated both respect for his defeated opponent and political wisdom about the importance of managing the transition from conquest to legitimate rule. The terms negotiated at Alni were remarkably generous considering the complete nature of Danish military victory. Rather than demanding Edmund's complete submission, Canute agreed to a division of England that left Edmund in control of Wessex, while recognizing Danish authority over the remainder of the kingdom. This arrangement reflected both Canute's confidence in his ultimate victory and his sophisticated understanding of the political advantages that came from appearing magnanimous in victory. The most crucial provision of the treaty concerned succession arrangements, stipulating that when either king died, the survivor would inherit the entire kingdom. This clause effectively made the treaty a temporary expedient rather than a permanent political settlement, but it provided both parties with face-saving formulas that allowed them to avoid the appearance of complete victory or total defeat. For Edmund, the arrangement preserved royal dignity and the possibility of future recovery, while for Canute, it provided a legitimate path to undisputed royal authority. The treaty also included provisions for the payment of tribute to Canute's army, reflecting the practical reality that Danish forces needed to be compensated for their military service and sustained during the transition to peacetime conditions. These tribute arrangements would later evolve into the more systematic taxation policies that characterize Canute's reign, demonstrating his early understanding of the administrative challenges involved in governing a conquered kingdom. The political arrangements established at Alni proved to be extraordinarily short-lived, as Edmund Ironside died unexpectedly on November 30th, 1016, less than 6 weeks after signing the treaty that had divided England between the two rivals. The suddenness of Edmund's death and the timing so soon after his military defeat naturally gave rise to suspicions about possible Danish involvement, though no contemporary sources provide credible evidence of assassination or other foul play. The circumstances of Edmund's death remain mysterious, with various chronicles offering different explanations ranging from illness to battle wounds to more sinister possibilities. Some sources suggest that he succumbed to injuries sustained during the Battle of Assandun, while others point to the exhaustion and stress of the prolonged military campaign as contributing factors. The lack of contemporary medical understanding makes it impossible to determine the exact cause, but the political consequences were immediate and decisive. Edmund's death eliminated the last significant obstacle to Canute's complete control over England, automatically triggering the succession provisions of the Alni Treaty and making Canute the undisputed king of all England. This dramatic change in circumstances came so soon after what had appeared to be a negotiated settlement that it seemed almost too convenient for Danish interests, fueling speculation about possible Danish involvement that would persist in later historical accounts. The immediate English response to Edmund's death demonstrated the extent to which Danish victory had already been accepted as inevitable by most of the English political class, rather than attempting to place another member of the West Saxon royal house on the throne. The leading English nobles quickly acknowledged Canute's claim to complete royal authority. This rapid acceptance reflected both practical recognition of Danish military superiority and genuine exhaustion after years of destructive warfare. The West Saxons, who had been Edmund's most loyal supporters throughout the conflict, formally submitted to Canute's authority within days of their king's death. This submission was particularly significant because Wessex represented the ancient heartland of English royal power and the traditional centre of resistance to foreign conquest. The willingness of even the most traditionally loyal English regions to accept Danish rule demonstrated the completeness of Canute's victory and the effectiveness of his political as well as military strategy. Canute's coronation as King of all England took place in London during 1017, a ceremony that was carefully orchestrated to demonstrate both the legitimacy of his rule and his respect for English royal traditions. The choice of London as the coronation venue reflected the city's symbolic importance as the commercial and political heart of England, while the involvement of Archbishop Lyfing of Canterbury provided crucial ecclesiastical endorsement for the new Danish dynasty. The coronation ceremony itself blended Danish and English traditions in ways that would become characteristic of Canut's entire approach to governance, while maintaining the essential elements of English royal ritual that would be familiar and acceptable to his new subjects. Canute also incorporated Scandinavian elements that affirmed his connection to the broader Northern European political world. This careful balance between innovation and tradition demonstrated the sophisticated political thinking that would characterize his reign. One of Canute's first acts as king was to address the practical challenges of integrating Danish conquerors with English subjects in ways that would create long-term stability rather than temporary accommodation. The systematic distribution of English estates to Danish followers provided necessary rewards for military service, while also creating a new aristocratic class with interests in maintaining the stability of the new regime. This policy was implemented with careful attention to avoiding the complete displacement of English noble families, instead creating a mixed aristocracy that combined Danish newcomers with English survivors. The question of marriage alliances became crucial to Canute's efforts to establish dynastic legitimacy and political stability. His decision to marry Emma of Normandy, the widow of the Thellard the Unready, represented a masterstroke of political calculation that addressed multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. By marrying into the previous royal house, Canute gained both symbolic connection to English royal tradition and practical neutralization of potential Norman support for rival claimants to the throne. The marriage to Emma also demonstrated Canute's sophisticated understanding of international diplomatic requirements. As the daughter of Richard I, Duke of Normandy, Emma brought with her connections to one of the most powerful courts in Western Europe and potential access to Norman military support should it ever be needed. The marriage thus served both domestic and international political objectives, while also providing Canute with a queen whose background and connections would be acceptable to English noble society. The early administrative policies implemented by Canute's government reflected a careful balance between Danish practices and English traditions that would become characteristic of his entire reign. Rather than imposing a completely foreign governmental system, Canute chose to work within existing English administrative structures while gradually introducing innovations that improved efficiency and strengthened royal authority. This evolutionary approach to governmental reform minimized resistance while achieving practical improvements in royal administration. As the gentle waves of conquest finally reach their peaceful shore, we see Canute transformed from a young Danish prince seeking vengeance into a sophisticated king who understood that true victory lay not just in military triumph, but in the delicate art of turning enemies into subjects and subjects into loyal supporters. The brutal years of warfare were ending, but the even more challenging task of building a lasting kingdom was just beginning. The year 1017 dawned upon an England transformed, where the smoke of battle had cleared to reveal a kingdom under new management, yet somehow familiar in its ancient rhythms. King Canute, no longer the vengeful prince who had returned for conquest, now faced the far more delicate challenge of transforming military victory into lasting political authority. The art of ruling conquered peoples, he would discover, required skills entirely different from those needed for conquest. Patience where war demanded action, diplomacy where battle called for force, and above all, the wisdom to know when to be merciful and when to be firm. The establishment of secure royal authority in medieval England required the systematic elimination of potential rivals. But Canute approached this necessary task with a sophistication that distinguished him from cruder conquerors who relied solely on mass executions and brutal intimidation. His understanding of English political culture, gained through years of observation and warfare, enabled him to identify which threats were genuine and which could be neutralized through less dramatic means. The case of Eadwig Thieling, one of Laethelred's surviving sons, illustrates both the ruthlessness and calculation that characterized Canute's approach to consolidating power. Eadwig had initially fled England during the Danish conquest, but had later returned, perhaps hoping that his uncle's victory had created opportunities for reconciliation and peaceful coexistence. Canute's decision to have him killed demonstrated that some threats to royal authority could not be managed through diplomacy or accommodation, regardless of the political costs involved. However, the fate of Edmund Ironside's young sons reveals a different aspect of Canute's political strategy. Rather than ordering their immediate execution, which would have been the traditional Viking response to potential dynastic rivals, Canute arranged for the children to be sent into exile in Hungary. This decision reflected both practical, political calculation and perhaps genuine reluctance to kill children who posed no immediate threat to his authority. The Hungarian exile would keep the boys safely distant from English politics while avoiding the moral opprobrium that would have accompanied their murder. The treatment of the broader English nobility required even more delicate handling, as Canute needed to maintain sufficient administrative expertise to govern the kingdom, while also ensuring that potential centers of resistance were neutralized. His solution involved a careful balance of reward and punishment that gradually transformed the English aristocratic class without completely destroying its traditional structures. Those who had demonstrated genuine loyalty during the conquest were permitted to retain their estates and positions, while those who had shown questionable allegiance found their lands redistributed to more reliable supporters. The redistribution of English estates to Danish followers was implemented with careful attention to maintaining economic productivity and social stability, rather than simply seizing all English property for distribution to his warriors. Canute ensured that experienced English administrators remained in place to manage the complex agricultural and commercial systems that generated the kingdom's wealth. This pragmatic approach reflected his understanding that successful rule required economic prosperity as well as military control. The integration of Danish settlers into English society proceeded through a variety of mechanisms designed to create lasting bonds between conquerors and conquered. Intermarriage between Danish warriors and English women was actively encouraged, creating family ties that would bind the two peoples together across generational lines. The establishment of joint commercial ventures between Danish and English merchants helped create economic interests that transcended ethnic divisions and provided incentives for peaceful cooperation. Canute's approach to English administration represented a fundamental innovation in medieval governance, combining the best elements of Scandinavian and English political traditions, while introducing entirely new concepts that would influence royal government for centuries to come. His reorganization of the English earldom system demonstrated both practical political wisdom and remarkable understanding of the administrative challenges involved in governing a large, diverse kingdom. The decision to divide England into four great earldoms, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria, reflected careful analysis of English political geography and the practical requirements of royal administration. Each earldom was large enough to provide substantial resources and military capability while remaining small enough to be managed effectively by a single administrator. The geographical boundaries were drawn to respect traditional regional identities while ensuring that no single earl could accumulate sufficient power to challenge royal authority. Canute's personal retention of direct control over Wessex was particularly significant, as this region represented both the ancient heartland of English royal power and the most economically productive area of the kingdom. By governing Wessex directly, rather than delegating its administration to a subordinate, Canute ensured that royal authority remained firmly rooted in English soil, while also maintaining personal control over the kingdom's most important resources. The appointment of earls to the other great administrative divisions demonstrated Canute's sophisticated understanding of the need to balance various political interests and ethnic loyalties. Thorkel, the Tall's assignment to East Anglia reflected both his military expertise and his familiarity with the heavily Danish population of that region. Eirike Hakanarsson, as continued control of Northumbria, recognized both his administrative competence and the special challenges involved in governing England's most remote and militarily sensitive frontier region. The case of Edric Striana's appointment to Mercia, followed by his rapid execution, illustrates the complexity of political calculations during this crucial period. Edric's treacherous behavior during the war against Edmund had made him valuable as an ally, but dangerous as a long-term administrator. His execution within a year of Canute's accession demonstrated that short-term political expedients would not be allowed to compromise long-term administrative effectiveness. The evolution of the earldom system under Canute's rule reflected his growing confidence in English loyalty, and his recognition that successful governance required the integration of English administrators into positions of real authority. The eventual appointment of Godwin, an Englishman from Sussex, to the crucial earldom of Wessex, represented a remarkable demonstration of trust that would have been unthinkable during the immediate aftermath of Conquest. One of Canute's most significant achievements as King of England was his transformation of the Danegeld from a desperate expedient for buying off Viking raiders into a sophisticated system of royal taxation that provided unprecedented resources for governmental administration and military operations. The collection of £72,000 in 1018 represented one of the largest monetary transactions in medieval European history and demonstrated both the wealth of England and the effectiveness of Canute's administrative machinery. The logistics of collecting such an enormous sum required administrative capabilities far beyond those possessed by any previous English government. The assessment of individual communities' tax obligations, the organization of collection procedures, the prevention of fraud and embezzlement, and the safe transport of precious metals to royal treasuries, all demanded sophisticated bureaucratic systems that Canute's government developed with remarkable efficiency. The decision to use a substantial portion of the Danegeld to pay off most of the Danish invasion army represented a crucial political calculation that demonstrated Canute's understanding of the long-term requirements for stable rule. While maintaining large numbers of foreign warriors might have provided short-term security advantages, their continued presence would have created ongoing financial burdens, while also serving as a constant reminder of foreign conquest that would have hindered the development of genuine English loyalty to the new regime. The retention of 40 ships and their crews as a permanent royal fleet represented the beginning of what would become one of medieval Europe's most formidable naval forces. This standing navy provided Canute with the capability to project power throughout the North Sea region while also ensuring rapid communication and transportation between the various territories that would eventually comprise his empire. The maintenance of professional naval forces also created a new category of royal service that provided opportunities for advancement to both Danish and English supporters. The annual Herregeld army payment that replaced the emergency Danegeld represented an innovative approach to royal finance that provided predictable revenues for governmental operations, while distributing the tax burden more fairly across the kingdom's population. This regularization of royal taxation marked an important step in the evolution of medieval governmental finance and provided a model that would be adopted by later English kings. The integration of English and Danish monetary systems under Canut's rule required careful attention to maintaining currency stability while also facilitating trade between England and Scandinavia. The standardization of coin weights and silver content helped create a unified monetary system that supported commercial development while also providing reliable sources of royal revenue through minting fees and currency regulation. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Canut's consolidation of English rule was his success in creating a unified legal system that respected both English and Danish traditions, while providing practical mechanisms for resolving disputes between members of different ethnic communities. The famous agreement reached at Oxford that promised to maintain Edgar's Law demonstrated Canut's understanding that successful rule required continuity with respected traditions rather than complete innovation. The reference to Edgar's Law was particularly significant because Edgar had been remembered as one of the most successful English kings, whose reign had been characterized by peace, prosperity, and effective administration. By promising to govern according to Edgar's example, Canute was positioning himself not as a foreign conqueror imposing alien customs, but as its legitimate successor to the best traditions of English kingship. The practical implementation of this legal synthesis required extensive collaboration between English and Danish legal experts who worked to identify areas of compatibility between the two legal traditions, while developing new procedures for handling conflicts that arose from cultural differences. The resulting legal code, while maintaining its essential English character, incorporated Danish concepts of honor, compensation, and dispute resolution that enriched the overall system. The role of Archbishop Wulfstan of York in developing legal policies was particularly crucial, as Wulfstan possessed both the theological expertise necessary for addressing religious aspects of legal questions and the practical experience required for effective legal administration. His influence helped ensure that Canut's legal innovations remained consistent with Christian principles while also respecting the legitimate interests of both English and Danish communities. The establishment of mixed juries and courts that included both English and Danish members helped create institutional mechanisms for fair resolution of interethnic disputes, while also providing forums for gradual cultural integration. These legal innovations demonstrated Canut's sophisticated understanding of the role that fair and impartial justice played in building genuine loyalty to royal authority. The protection of church rights and privileges represented another crucial aspect of Canut's legal policy, as ecclesiastical support was essential for establishing legitimate royal authority in Christian Europe. His generous donations to religious institutions and his protection of church property helped establish his reputation as a pious Christian king, while also securing the political support of the most influential institution in medieval society. The death of Harold II of Denmark in 1018 or 1019 created both an opportunity and a challenge for Canute that would fundamentally transform the scope of his political ambitions. As Harold's brother and the most successful military leader in the Danish royal family, Canute possessed legitimate claims to the Danish throne, but the assertion of those claims would require him to balance his responsibilities as King of England with his obligations to his Danish homeland. The political situation in Denmark following Harold's death was complex and potentially unstable, with various factions supporting different approaches to succession and governance. Some Danish nobles favored maintaining the separation between English and Danish crowns, fearing that Canut's English responsibilities would lead to neglect of specifically Danish interests. Others recognized the potential advantages of uniting the two kingdoms under a single ruler who had demonstrated remarkable administrative and military capabilities. Canut's decision to personally travel to Denmark to assert his succession claims demonstrated both his commitment to maintaining his Scandinavian roots and his confidence in the stability of his English kingdom. The fact that he could leave England for extended periods so soon after completing its conquest testified to the effectiveness of his administrative arrangements and the genuine acceptance that his rule had achieved among the English population. The letter that Canute sent to his English subjects during his absence in Denmark provides fascinating insight into his political thinking during this crucial period. His explanation that he had gone abroad to avert an unspecified danger suggested both his concern for English security and his understanding that successful rule required constant vigilance against potential threats from multiple directions. The successful assertion of Canute's Danish succession claims brought immediate benefits in terms of enhanced resources and international prestige, but it also created new challenges in terms of governmental coordination and strategic planning. The administration of two separate kingdoms with different traditions, languages, and political cultures required innovative approaches to royal government that would stretch Canute's administrative capabilities to their limits. The appointment of Ulf Jarl as regent of Denmark represented a crucial decision that would have long-term consequences for the stability of Canute's northern empire. Ulf's marriage to Canute's sister Estrid provided family connections that seemed to ensure loyalty, while his demonstrated administrative competence made him an obvious choice for the challenging task of governing Denmark during Canute's absences. In England, the emergence of Olaf to Haraldson as King of Norway presented Canute with his most serious external threat and the greatest opportunity for expanding his empire beyond its existing English and Danish boundaries. Olaf, later canonized as Saint Olaf, possessed both the military capabilities and the religious authority necessary to unite Norwegian resistance against Danish influence, while also potentially inspiring broader Scandinavian opposition to Canute's growing power. The strategic importance of Norway in North Sea politics could hardly be overstated, as Norwegian control of key maritime routes and coastal strongholds could potentially isolate Denmark from its traditional allies, while also threatening English security through Norwegian supports for anti-Danish conspiracies. Canute's recognition of this threat led to the development of one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated intelligence and subversion operations. The campaign to undermine Olaf's authority in Norway demonstrated Canute's evolution from a primarily military leader to a sophisticated political strategist who understood that the most decisive victories were often achieved through diplomatic and economic means rather than battlefield confrontations. The systematic bribery of Norwegian nobles and the careful cultivation of internal Norwegian opposition to Olaf's rule represented innovative approaches to international conflict that would influence medieval warfare for generations. The effectiveness of Canute's subversion campaign can be measured by the speed with which Norwegian resistance to Olaf collapsed when Danish military pressure was finally applied. The invasion fleet of 50 ships that Canute led to Norway in 1028 found little organized opposition, as the groundwork laid by years of political preparation had already undermined the foundations of Olaf's authority. The ceremonial aspects of Canute's assumption of Norwegian royal authority were carefully orchestrated to demonstrate both the legitimacy of his claims and his respect for Norwegian traditions and customs. His acclamation as king at the Erething in Trondheim followed traditional Norwegian procedures while also incorporating elements that emphasized his role as a unifying figure who could bring peace and prosperity to the war-torn Norwegian kingdom. The flight of Olaf II to Sweden marked the apparent completion of Canute's northern empire, but it also created new challenges in terms of maintaining Norwegian loyalty and preventing Swedish intervention in support of the exiled king. The complex web of Scandinavian political relationships meant that success in one kingdom could create new vulnerabilities in others, requiring constant diplomatic attention to maintain the delicate balance of power. The Battle of Helge, fought around 1026 at the mouth of the Helge River, represented the decisive military engagement that confirmed Canut's dominance over Scandinavian politics, while also demonstrating the sophisticated level of medieval naval warfare that had evolved during his reign. The battle emerged from a coalition of Swedish and Norwegian forces seeking to challenge Danish hegemony in the Baltic region and restore the traditional balance of power among the Scandinavian kingdoms. The strategic situation leading up to the battle was extraordinarily complex, involving not only the primary combatants, but also various allied forces, shifting political allegiances, and competing claims to territorial control throughout the region. King Olaf II of Norway and King Anund Jacob of Sweden had formed an alliance specifically designed to counter what they perceived as the growing threat of Danish dominance under Canut's leadership. The involvement of Alf Jarl on the side of the Swedish-Norwegian coalition represented a personal betrayal that cut particularly deeply for Canute, as Ulf's defection violated not only political loyalty but also family bonds. Ulf's decision to join the coalition against his brother-in-law reflected both his assessment of military probabilities and his concerns about the long-term implications of Canut's imperial ambitions for traditional Danish independence. The naval tactics employed during the Battle of Helge demonstrated the evolution of Scandinavian warfare beyond the traditional Viking model of individual ship-to-ship combat toward more sophisticated fleet operations that required careful coordination and strategic planning. Canut's ability to surprise the enemy fleet and gain tactical advantage through superior positioning and timing reflected both his personal growth as a military commander and the professional development of his naval forces. The aftermath of the battle confirmed Canut's position as the dominant power in northern European politics, while also providing him with the prestige and military reputation necessary to maintain authority over his diverse territories. The flight of Olaf and the dispersal of the Swedish-Norwegian coalition eliminated the most serious external threat to Canut's empire, while also demonstrating to potential future opponents the futility of challenging Danish military supremacy. The political consequences of the Helge victory extended far beyond the immediate military results, as the battle's outcome influenced diplomatic relationships throughout northern Europe and established Canute as a figure of international importance whose friendship or enmity could significantly affect the fortunes of other medieval rulers. Following his victory at Helge, Canute began to style himself as king of all England and Denmark and the Norwegians and of some of the Swedes, a title that reflected both his actual territorial control and his broader imperial ambitions for Scandinavian unification under Danish leadership. The reference to some of the Swedes acknowledged the complex political reality of Swedish resistance while also asserting legitimate claims to portions of Swedish territory. The evidence for Canut's actual control over Swedish territories remains somewhat ambiguous, with coins bearing his name found in Swedish archaeological contexts, but limited narrative evidence for sustained administrative control. The minting of coins, claiming Swedish royal authority, may have represented more of a propaganda gesture than actual governmental control, though it demonstrated Canut's understanding of the symbolic importance of currency in establishing political legitimacy. The strategic importance of Swedish territories lay not only in their economic resources, but also in their control of crucial Baltic trade routes that connected Scandinavia with the broader European commercial network. Swedish cooperation or opposition could significantly affect the prosperity of Canut's other territories, making some form of Swedish accommodation essential for the long-term success of his imperial project. The relationship between Canute and various Swedish regional leaders appears to have varied considerably depending on local political conditions and personal loyalties. Some Swedish nobles may have genuinely accepted Danish overlordship in exchange for protection and commercial advantages, while others maintained nominal submission while preserving practical independence. The limitations of Canute's Swedish control became apparent relatively quickly, as effective governance of distant territories required administrative resources and military commitments that strained even his considerable capabilities. The Swedish portions of his empire represented the most tenuous and short-lived aspects of his imperial achievement, highlighting the practical difficulties involved in maintaining control over territories that lacked clear cultural or economic ties to the imperial center. Canute's decision to undertake a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027 represented one of the most sophisticated examples of medieval diplomatic strategy, combining genuine religious devotion with brilliant political calculation to achieve multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. The journey occurred at the perfect moment in European politics, timed to coincide with the coronation of Conrad II as Holy Roman Emperor and thereby ensuring maximum diplomatic impact from Canute's presence at this crucial international gathering. The religious motivations for the pilgrimage were undoubtedly genuine, reflecting both Canute's personal Christian faith and his understanding of the political importance of demonstrating piety to his Christian subjects and international peers. His letter describing the journey emphasizes his desire to seek forgiveness for his sins, pray for the welfare of his subjects, and fulfill religious obligations that were expected of a Christian king. This combination of personal devotion and political calculation exemplified the sophisticated approach to leadership that characterized Canute's entire reign. The diplomatic preparations for the journey required months of careful coordination with various European courts and ecclesiastical authorities, the logistics of ensuring safe passage through multiple kingdoms, arranging appropriate accommodations and ceremonies, and managing the complex protocols required for such a high-profile international visit demanded administrative capabilities of the highest order. The symbolic significance of a Scandinavian king undertaking such a pilgrimage could hardly be overstated, as it represented the ultimate integration of Viking political culture with Christian European civilization. Previous Scandinavian rulers had remained largely outside the mainstream of European diplomatic and religious life, but Canute's pilgrimage demonstrated his acceptance as an equal member of the community of Christian kings. The international attention that Canute's pilgrimage attracted provided unprecedented opportunities for diplomatic negotiations with European leaders, who might otherwise have been difficult to reach through normal diplomatic channels. The informal atmosphere of pilgrimage allowed for personal relationships to develop that could facilitate future negotiations and alliance-building efforts. The central diplomatic achievement of Canute's Roman journey was his successful negotiation with Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II, whose imperial authority made him the most powerful ruler in medieval Europe, and therefore the most valuable potential ally for Canute's international objectives. The personal relationship that developed between the two monarchs during their time in Rome would have lasting consequences for both the Danish Empire and the broader European political balance. The specific agreements reached between Canute and Conrad addressed both immediate practical concerns and longer-term strategic objectives. The reduction of tolls and barriers for English and Danish merchants traveling through imperial territories provided tangible economic benefits that would enhance the prosperity of Canute's kingdoms, while also demonstrating the practical value of his diplomatic efforts to his subjects. The marriage agreement between Conrad's son Henry and Canute's daughter Gunhilda represented the ultimate diplomatic triumph. creating family bonds between the Danish and imperial houses that would provide security and prestige for generations. This dynastic alliance elevated Canut's international status to unprecedented heights, while also ensuring that his descendants would remain connected to the highest levels of European nobility. The territorial concessions that Conrad made regarding Schleswig and the border regions between Denmark and the Holy Roman Empire resolved long-standing sources of conflict, while also providing Canute with valuable strategic territory that enhanced Danish security. These territorial gains were achieved through diplomatic negotiation rather than military conquest, demonstrating the effectiveness of Canute's new approach to international relations. The ceremonial aspects of Canute's interactions with Conrad were carefully orchestrated to demonstrate their equality and mutual respect. The fact that Canute was permitted to walk alongside the emperor in imperial processions and stand with him during ceremonial occasions represented unprecedented recognition of Scandinavian royal dignity by the highest authorities of Christian Europe. The personal friendship that developed between Canute and Conrad appears to have been genuine as well as politically motivated, with contemporary sources noting their similar ages and compatible temperaments. This personal dimension of their relationship provided additional security for the diplomatic agreements they reached, while also creating opportunities for future cooperation that extended beyond formal treaty obligations. Canute's negotiations with Pope John XIX represented another crucial aspect of his Roman diplomacy, addressing specifically ecclesiastical concerns that were essential for maintaining church support throughout his territories. The successful resolution of disputes regarding the costs of the pallium for English archbishops provided significant financial relief for the English Church, while also demonstrating Canute's effectiveness as an advocate for his subjects' interests. The question of ecclesiastical jurisdiction between the archdioceses of Canterbury and Hamburg-Bremen had created ongoing tensions that threatened to undermine church unity within Canute's territories. His successful mediation of this dispute through papal intervention demonstrated both his diplomatic skill and his beclouding of the importance of ecclesiastical harmony for effective governance. The negotiations regarding improved conditions for pilgrims and merchants traveling to Rome addressed practical concerns that affected thousands of Canute's subjects, while also enhancing his reputation as a protector of Christian interests. The reduction of unjust tolls and the guarantee of safe passage represented tangible benefits that would be appreciated throughout his kingdoms. The papal recognition of Canute's legitimacy as a Christian king provided crucial international endorsement for his rule, while also helping to integrate Scandinavian political culture more fully into the mainstream of European Christian civilization. This ecclesiastical approval was particularly important given the recent pagan history of Scandinavian kingdoms and the suspicions that still existed among some Christian authorities about the genuine nature of Scandinavian conversion. The establishment of direct diplomatic relations between Canute's court and the papal administration created ongoing channels for communication and cooperation that would benefit both parties. The papacy gained a powerful protector and supporter in Northern Europe, while Canute secured ecclesiastical endorsement for his political objectives and access to papal influence in international affairs. The broader impact of Canute's Roman journey extended far beyond the specific diplomatic agreements he negotiated, as his presence at Conrad's coronation and his successful integration into the highest levels of European ceremonial life fundamentally altered perceptions of Scandinavian political culture throughout medieval Europe. The transformation of Viking rulers from peripheral raiders into central figures in European diplomacy represented a remarkable evolution that would influence international relations for generations. The recognition that Canute received from other European rulers during his time in Rome demonstrated the extent to which military success and effective governance had overcome traditional prejudices against Scandinavian political culture. His acceptance as an equal among Christian kings represented the ultimate achievement of integration into European diplomatic society. The network of personal relationships that Canute established during his Roman journey provided ongoing diplomatic advantages that extended far beyond the immediate benefits of specific agreements. The informal connections created through shared ceremonial experiences and personal interactions often proved more valuable than formal treaty obligations in facilitating future negotiations and cooperation. The propaganda value of Canute's Roman triumph was enormous throughout his territories, as detailed accounts of his diplomatic successes and the honors he received provided powerful evidence of his international stature and the benefits that his rule brought to his subjects. The ability to point to concrete achievements in terms of reduced tolls, improved trading conditions, and enhanced international prestige helped justify the costs of his rule while also building genuine loyalty among diverse populations. The cultural impact of Canute's successful integration into European Christian society helped accelerate the transformation of Scandinavian civilization from its pagan Viking origins toward full participation in medieval European culture. This transformation would have lasting consequences for the development of Northern European societies and their relationships with the broader European community. By 1030, Canute had achieved what no ruler before or since would accomplish: the unification of virtually the entire North Sea region under a single crown. His empire stretched from the Scottish Highlands in the west to the Danish islands in the east, from the Norwegian fjords in the north to the English Channel in the south, creating a maritime empire whose only parallel was the Mediterranean dominance. Achieved by Rome at its peak, the strategic brilliance of this North Sea empire lay not merely in its geographical extent, but in its economic and political integration. The control of all major ports and shipping routes around the North Sea allowed Canute to regulate trade, collect customs duties, and coordinate economic policies in ways that generated unprecedented wealth, while also providing the resources necessary to maintain his extensive military and administrative establishments. The naval supremacy that undergirded Canute's empire represented a revolutionary development in medieval warfare and international relations. His fleet, drawn from the combined resources of England, Denmark, and Norway, was far larger and more technically advanced than any previous Northern European naval force. This maritime dominance allowed him to project power rapidly across vast distances, while also ensuring secure communications between the various territories of his empire. The famous description of Canute as ruler of all England and Denmark and the Norwegians and of some of the Swedes represented not mere boastful rhetoric, but an accurate assessment of territorial control that encompassed virtually every significant political entity in Northern Europe. This unprecedented concentration of power in a single ruler created both opportunities and challenges that would test Canute's administrative and diplomatic capabilities to their limits. The integration of diverse populations within the North Sea empire required innovative approaches to governance that respected local traditions while maintaining overall imperial unity. Canute's success in managing these complex cultural and political differences demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the principles of federal governance that would not be fully developed elsewhere. In Europe for centuries, the economic prosperity that characterized the North Sea Empire during its peak years provided tangible evidence of the benefits that political unification could bring to previously fragmented regions. Trade flourished under unified administration, while the elimination of internal conflicts allowed resources to be devoted to productive activities rather than military preparations. Canute's expedition to Scotland in 1031 represented the culmination of his imperial ambitions and the ultimate demonstration of the international reach that his North Sea Empire had achieved. The submission of Malcolm III of Scotland, along with two other Scottish kings, including Ecgmarchach mac Ronial, marked the effective extension of Canut's authority over the entire British Isles and adjacent maritime regions. The strategic importance of Scottish submission extended far beyond the immediate prestige value, as Scottish cooperation was essential for securing the northern frontiers of England, while also preventing potential alliances between Scottish rulers and Canut's enemies. In Scandinavia, the tributary relationship established with the Scottish kings provided both security and revenue, while avoiding the administrative challenges that would have accompanied direct annexation of Scottish territories. The identity of Ecgmarchach mac Ragnar as a sea king whose domains included Galloway and the Isle of Man illustrates the complex maritime political networks that characterized the North Sea world during this period. His submission to Canute represented not just the acknowledgement of Danish superiority, but also the integration of important naval and commercial resources into the broader imperial system. The methods employed to achieve Scottish submission reflected Canute's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military demonstration and diplomatic negotiation, rather than attempting to conquer Scotland through prolonged military campaigns. He utilized overwhelming force displays combined with attractive terms for voluntary submission to achieve his objectives with minimal bloodshed and cost. The tribute arrangements established with the Scottish rulers provided ongoing revenue for imperial administration, while also creating economic incentives for continued cooperation. These financial relationships helped ensure that Scottish submission would be maintained through economic interests rather than mere military intimidation. The influence that Canute's Scottish expedition had on contemporary perceptions of his power can hardly be overstated, as the submission of traditionally independent Celtic kingdoms demonstrated to European observers that his authority extended far beyond his Scandinavian and English core territories to encompass virtually the entire northwestern European periphery. Canute's influence in the Irish Sea region represented, perhaps, the most complex and diplomatically sophisticated aspect of his imperial achievement, involving intricate networks of alliance and tribute that connected his empire with the Gallic kingdoms of Ireland and the Norse settlements that dotted the western maritime regions. The evidence for this influence comes primarily from coinage and skaldic poetry, sources that reveal the extent of Canute's authority, while also highlighting the indirect nature of his control over these distant territories. The appearance of coins bearing Canute's name and royal symbols in Dublin and other Irish Norse settlements provides concrete evidence of his authority in regions that might otherwise seem too distant from his primary territories to have been effectively controlled. These coins represent more than mere symbols, as they indicate actual commercial and political relationships that brought tangible benefits to both Canute's empire and the local communities that acknowledged his authority. The political complexity of the Irish Sea region during this period stemmed from the interaction between traditional Gaelic political structures, established Norse settlements, and newer commercial networks that connected these areas with broader European trading systems. Canute's success in integrating himself into these complex relationships demonstrates remarkable diplomatic flexibility and cultural sensitivity. The verse by Uttar Svati that describes Canute as ruler of the Danes, the Irish, the English, and the islanders provides contemporary confirmation of the scope of his authority, while also illustrating the ways in which imperial power was understood and celebrated by those who witnessed its exercise. The omission of Norway from this particular verse likely reflects the date of composition rather than actual limitations on Canute's authority. The strategic importance of Irish sea control lay primarily in its commercial and naval implications, as these maritime routes connected Canut's empire with trading networks that extended to Iceland, Greenland, and potentially even North America through the Scandinavian colonies that had been established in those distant regions. Control over these routes provided both economic benefits and strategic flexibility for imperial defense and expansion. The tribute relationships that Canute established with various Celtic and Norse rulers in the Irish Sea region created a network of client kingdoms that extended imperial influence far beyond the boundaries of direct territorial control. These arrangements provided the benefits of empire, while avoiding the administrative costs and cultural conflicts that would have accompanied direct annexation by 1031. Canute had achieved a concentration of political, military, and economic power that was unprecedented in medieval European history and would never be equaled by any subsequent Northern European ruler. His empire controlled virtually all maritime trade in the North Sea and adjacent waters, commanded naval forces larger than those of any contemporary rival, and generated revenues that exceeded those available to most other medieval kingdoms. Combined, the international recognition of Canute's achievement was demonstrated by the deference shown to him by other European rulers and the careful attention paid to his diplomatic preferences by powers as distant as the papacy and the the Roman Empire. His opinion was sought on major international questions, while his support was courted by rulers throughout Europe, who recognized the practical benefits that his alliance could provide. The administrative achievements of Canute's empire were equally remarkable, as he had successfully created governmental systems that could effectively manage territories separated by hundreds of miles of often dangerous waters, while maintaining cultural and political unity across populations that spoke different languages and followed different traditional customs. This administrative integration represented innovations in federal governance that would not be matched elsewhere in Europe for centuries. The military capabilities of the North Sea Empire at its peak included not only the largest naval force in northern European waters, but also land armies that combined the traditional fighting qualities of Scandinavian warriors with the disciplined tactical approaches that had been developed through years of campaigning in the diverse terrains of England, Denmark, and Norway. The economic prosperity generated by imperial unification provided unprecedented resources for cultural and religious patronage, enabling Canute to support literary, artistic, and architectural projects throughout his territories, while also funding the religious institutions that played crucial roles in maintaining social stability and cultural development. The personal authority that Canute had achieved by 1031 rested not merely on military success or administrative efficiency, but on the genuine recognition by diverse populations that his rule provided benefits in terms of security, prosperity, and international prestige that could not be achieved through traditional political fragmentation. This popular acceptance represented the ultimate achievement of successful imperial governance. As we float gently toward sleep on the peaceful currents of history, we can imagine Canute standing on the ramparts of his palace at Winchester, gazing out over a realm that stretched beyond any horizon visible to human eyes, an empire won through courage, maintained through wisdom, and destined to live forever in the memory of those who dream of what unity and good governance can achieve when guided by both strength and mercy. The decade of the 1030s found Canute transformed from the ambitious young conqueror who had once stood on Danish shores dreaming of English wealth into something far greater and more complexer, statesman whose influence shaped the destiny of nations, a king whose wisdom was sought by emperors and popes, and a ruler whose empire represented the pinnacle of medieval achievement in Northern Europe. Yet, with this unprecedented success came equally unprecedented challenges. as the very scope of his accomplishments created new problems that would test his political genius to its limits. The administration of Canut's vast North Sea Empire required a level of political sophistication that had never before been attempted in medieval Europe. Unlike the more homogeneous kingdoms that characterized most contemporary realms, Canut's empire encompassed peoples who spoke different languages, followed different customs, practiced different legal traditions, and maintained distinct cultural identities that had been shaped by centuries of separate historical development. The challenge of governing England alone would have tested any medieval ruler. But Canute faced the far more complex task of maintaining harmony between English, Danish, and Norwegian populations while also managing the diverse Celtic and Germanic tribes that populated the peripheries of his empire. Each of these groups possessed their own traditional leaders, their own concepts of legitimate authority, and their own expectations about the relationship between rulers and subjects. Canute's solution to these challenges demonstrated remarkable political intuition and diplomatic flexibility. Rather than attempting to impose a uniform governmental system across all his territories, he developed what might be called a federal approach to imperial administration, allowing each region to maintain its traditional structures while ensuring that ultimate authority remained centered in his person and the administrative apparatus he had created. In England, Canute continued to govern through the earldom system he had established during his initial consolidation of power, but with important modifications that reflected his growing confidence in English loyalty and his recognition that effective governance required the integration of native administrators into positions of real responsibility. The appointment of Godwin to the crucial earldom of Wessex represented the culmination of this process, demonstrating that merit and loyalty could overcome ethnic differences in determining governmental appointments. The administration of Denmark required different approaches that reflected both the kingdom's role as Canute's ancestral homeland and its function as the strategic center of his Scandinavian territories. The appointment of regents during his frequent absences in England created opportunities for both effective local governance and potential political instability, as ambitious nobles might use periods of royal absence to build independent power bases that could challenge imperial authority. The Norwegian situation was perhaps the most delicate of all, as Canute's authority there rested primarily on military conquest rather than traditional legitimacy or popular acceptance. The installation of his son Sweyn and Galfgifu of Northampton as regents represented an attempt to provide both dynastic continuity and experienced administration, but it also created cultural tensions that would ultimately prove impossible to resolve through purely political means. One of Canute's greatest achievements as an imperial ruler was his success in creating economic policies that enhanced prosperity throughout his territories, while also generating the revenues necessary to maintain the extensive military and administrative establishments required for effective imperial governance. The unification of previously separate kingdoms under a single authority created unprecedented opportunities for trade, expansion, and commercial development. The elimination of internal barriers to trade within the empire provided immediate benefits to merchants and craftsmen throughout Canute's territories, as goods could now move freely between England, Denmark, and Norway without the customs duties, political restrictions, and security concerns that had previously limited commercial activity. This internal free trade zone was centuries ahead of its time in terms of economic sophistication and contributed significantly to the prosperity that characterized the empire. During its peak years, the standardization of currency systems across imperial territories represented another major achievement that facilitated commercial development while also providing practical symbols of political unity. The ability to use English silver pennies throughout Scandinavia or Danish coins in English markets, simplified trade calculations, while also demonstrating the practical benefits of imperial unity to ordinary subjects, who might otherwise have little direct contact with royal government. Canut's control over maritime trade routes provided opportunities for commercial regulation and taxation that generated substantial revenues, while also giving him significant influence over the economic development of regions far beyond his direct territorial control. The ability to regulate access to key ports and shipping lanes made cooperation with his empire economically attractive, even for independent rulers, who might otherwise have opposed his political ambitions. The development of new trading relationships with distant regions represented another dimension of Canut's economic policy that enhanced imperial prosperity while also expanding international influence. The establishment of direct commercial connections with the Byzantine Empire, the German states, and even regions as distant as the Mediterranean provided access to luxury goods and exotic products that enhanced the prestige of imperial courts, while also generating substantial customs revenues. The protection that imperial naval forces provided to merchant shipping helped reduce the costs and risks associated with long-distance trade, making commercial ventures more profitable, while also encouraging the development of new trading routes and relationships. This protection was particularly valuable in the often dangerous waters of the North Sea and Baltic, where pirates and hostile fleets could easily disrupt commercial activity. Canut's approach to religious policy throughout his empire demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the crucial role that ecclesiastical institutions played in medieval governance, while also reflecting his genuine personal devotion to Christian principles and his recognition of the Church's importance in legitimizing royal authority among diverse populations. The challenge of religious administration was complicated by the varying degrees of Christianization that existed throughout imperial territories. While England had been thoroughly Christian for centuries, and Denmark was well along in the conversion process, Norway and the more remote regions of the empire retained significant pagan populations whose traditional beliefs and practices needed to be respected even as Christian authority was gradually extended. Canut's generous patronage of religious institutions throughout his territories served multiple purposes beyond simple, pious devotion. The construction and endowment of churches and monasteries provided visible demonstrations of royal Christian commitment, while also creating institutional structures that could help maintain political loyalty and cultural unity across diverse populations. The integration of church hierarchy into imperial administration provided Canute with a network of educated administrators whose loyalty to Christian principles and clerical authority could supplement and reinforce purely secular governmental structures. Bishops and abbots often possessed administrative skills and educational backgrounds that made them valuable governmental officials, while their religious authority provided additional legitimacy for imperial policies. The careful balance that Canute maintained between respecting local religious traditions and promoting imperial Christian unity demonstrated remarkable sensitivity to the cultural complexities involved in governing diverse populations. Rather than attempting to impose uniform religious practices throughout his territories, he allowed for regional variations that respected traditional customs while gradually encouraging movement toward greater Christian orthodoxy. The support that Canute provided for scholarly and artistic activities within religious institutions helped create cultural achievements that enhanced the prestige of his empire, while also preserving and developing intellectual traditions that might otherwise have been lost during this turbulent period in European history. The military requirements of defending and maintaining Canute's vast empire represented unprecedented challenges in terms of both strategic planning and logistical organization. The geographical extent of imperial territories, combined with the diverse threats that could emerge from various directions required military capabilities far beyond those possessed by any previous Northern European ruler. The naval forces that formed the backbone of imperial defense represented the most sophisticated maritime military organization of the medieval period, combining traditional Scandinavian seamanship with innovative tactical approaches that reflected lessons learned through years of warfare in diverse maritime environments. The ability to rapidly deploy substantial naval forces throughout the North Sea and Baltic regions provided crucial strategic flexibility for imperial defense. The integration of land forces from different territories created opportunities for combined arms operations that enhanced military effectiveness while also providing practical demonstrations of imperial unity. English infantry, Danish cavalry, and Norwegian archers could be combined in tactical formations that maximized their respective strengths while compensating for individual weaknesses. The development of fortified bases throughout imperial territories provided both defensive strongholds and logistical centers that could support military operations across vast distances. These strategic installations represented major investments in military infrastructure that demonstrated Canut's long-term commitment to imperial defense and his understanding of the complex requirements involved in projecting power across maritime distances. The intelligence networks that Canute developed to monitor potential threats throughout his territories represented another innovation in imperial military organization, providing early warning of hostile activities while also enabling diplomatic intervention before military responses became necessary. These intelligence systems helped prevent conflicts through political means while also ensuring that military responses, when necessary, could be precisely targeted and effectively coordinated. Canute's personal relationships and family arrangements reflected both the political necessities of medieval kingship and the complex cultural transitions that characterized his reign. His marriages to Gylfgifu of Northampton and Emma of Normandy represented not merely personal choices, but carefully calculated political alliances that served crucial strategic objectives while also creating potential sources of dynastic instability and succession conflicts. The relationship with Gylfgifu of Northampton appears to have begun during Canute's early years in England, possibly during his father's initial conquest in 1013. Gylfgifu's family background, as the daughter of a Northumbrian alderman who had been murdered with King Lelred's connivance, provided both romantic appeal and political significance, as her marriage to Canute helped demonstrate his commitment to avenging wrongs committed against English nobles, while also creating valuable connections to northern English political networks. The question of whether Canute's relationship with Gylfgifu constituted a legitimate marriage according to contemporary Christian standards remains historically controversial. Some sources suggest that the Church did not recognize their union as valid, possibly due to concerns about proper canonical procedures or the political implications of acknowledging the marriage. This ambiguity would later create complications for the succession claims of their sons. The subsequent marriage to Emma of Normandy in 1017 represented one of Canute's most brilliant political calculations, simultaneously neutralizing potential Norman support for rival English claimants, while also creating valuable connections to one of the most powerful and sophisticated courts in Western Europe. Emma's previous marriage to Tethlard the Unready provided additional legitimacy for Canute's rule, while also demonstrating respect for English royal traditions. The dual marriage arrangements created a complex family structure that reflected the realities of medieval royal polygamy, while also generating potential sources of conflict between different branches of Canute's family. The children of these relationships would each possess legitimate claims to various portions of imperial territory, creating succession scenarios that could easily lead to civil war if not carefully managed. The management of these complex family relationships required diplomatic skills equal to those needed for international negotiations, as Canute had to balance the competing interests and expectations of different wives and children, while also considering the broader political implications of various succession arrangements for imperial stability. Canute's approach to succession planning reflected his sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in maintaining imperial unity across multiple kingdoms, while also respecting the traditional inheritance practices of different cultural groups within his territories. His decision to designate different sons as heirs to different portions of the empire demonstrated both practical political wisdom and perhaps fatal miscalculation about the feasibility of maintaining imperial coordination under divided leadership. Harold Harefoot, Canute's son by Glafgyfu of Northampton, was positioned to inherit England, the wealthiest and most strategically important portion of the empire. Harold's maternal connections to northern English nobility provided valuable political assets for governing England, while his personal characteristics apparently impressed contemporary observers with his suitability for royal responsibility. Sweyn Forkbeard, the elder son of Canute and Glafgyfu, was designated as King of Norway, a choice that reflected both his administrative experience as regent and his mother's apparent familiarity with Norwegian political conditions. However, this appointment would prove to be one of Canute's most serious political miscalculations, as both Sweyn and Glafgyfu became intensely unpopular among Norwegian subjects. Cnut, Canute's son by Emma of Normandy, was proclaimed King of Denmark during a great court ceremony at Trondheim, a designation that emphasized his legitimacy as heir to Canute's ancestral kingdom, while also providing valuable connections to Norman and broader European political networks through his mother's family. The decision to divide imperial succession among multiple heirs reflected traditional Scandinavian inheritance practices, while also acknowledging the practical difficulties involved in governing such vast territories from a single center. However, this approach also virtually guaranteed future conflicts between the different branches of Canute's family and the eventual fragmentation of imperial unity. The education and preparation that each of these potential heirs received reflected Canute's understanding of the different skills and knowledge that would be required for governing different portions of his empire. Each son was exposed to the particular cultural, linguistic, and political traditions of his designated inheritance, while also receiving broader education in the arts of medieval kingship. The regency of Glafgyfu and Sweyn in Norway represented perhaps the greatest failure of Canute's career, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated political planning could not overcome fundamental cultural incompatibilities and administrative miscalculations. The period that became known as Glafgyfu's time in Norwegian historical memory serves as a cautionary tale about the limitations of imperial governance in medieval Europe. The initial appointment of Glafgyfu and Sweyn as Norwegian regents had seemed logical from Canute's perspective, as it provided experienced administrators with family connections to the imperial dynasty, while also ensuring that Norwegian governance would remain under direct imperial control. However, this arrangement failed to account for the deep cultural differences between English and Norwegian political traditions and the extent of Norwegian resentment toward foreign rule. The taxation policies implemented by Glafgyfu's administration became a particular source of Norwegian discontent, as the attempt to impose Danish administrative procedures on Norwegian society created both practical hardships and symbolic affronts to traditional Norwegian independence. The Norwegian population, accustomed to relatively light royal taxation and significant local autonomy, found anew fiscal demands, both economically burdensome and politically offensive. The cultural insensitivity displayed by the Regency administration in dealing with Norwegian customs and traditions created additional sources of resentment that gradually undermined any initial acceptance of Canut's authority. The preference shown for Danish customs and officials in governmental appointments reinforced Norwegian perceptions that they were being treated as conquered subjects rather than valued members of an imperial federation. The military measures taken to enforce compliance with Regency policies only served to increase Norwegian opposition, while also draining imperial resources that might have been better used for more constructive purposes. The cycle of resistance and repression that developed during Gleifgifju's time demonstrated the fundamental incompatibility between Norwegian political culture and the administrative approaches that had proven successful in other portions of Canut's empire. The eventual rebellion that forced Gleifgifu and Sweyn to flee Norway represented not merely a local political failure, but a serious blow to imperial prestige that encouraged opposition movements throughout Canut's territories. The restoration of Norwegian independence under Magnus the Good marked the beginning of the imperial fragmentation that would accelerate after Canut's death. The marriage arrangements made for Canut's daughter, Gunhilda, represented another dimension of his dynastic planning that demonstrated both his international ambitions and his sophisticated understanding of the role that marriage alliances played in medieval diplomacy. The betrothal of Gunhilda to Henry III, son of Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II, represented the culmination of the diplomatic relationship that Canute had established with the imperial court during his pilgrimage to Rome. This marriage alliance created the potential for future cooperation between the Danish Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, while also ensuring that Canut's descendants would remain connected to the highest levels of European nobility. The prospect of having a grandson who might someday become Holy Roman Emperor represented unprecedented international prestige for a Scandinavian royal house. The tragic death of Gunhilda in Italy before she could become Empress Consort eliminated one of the most promising aspects of Canut's dynastic planning, while also removing a crucial connection between his empire and the broader European political system. This loss represented both personal tragedy and significant political setback for imperial long-term prospects. The implications of Gunhilda's death extended beyond immediate diplomatic considerations to affect the fundamental question of whether Canut's empire could successfully integrate itself into the mainstream of European political development. The marriage alliance with the imperial house had represented the ultimate acceptance of Scandinavian political culture by the highest authorities of Christian Europe. The failure to achieve this dynastic connection may have contributed to the international isolation that would characterize the later years of Canut's empire and the reduced support that his successors would receive from European powers during the succession crises that followed his death. The story of Canute and the tides has become perhaps the most enduring legend associated with his reign, though its historical authenticity remains a subject of scholarly debate. The tale, as recorded by Henry of Huntingdon in the early 12th century, describes how Canute commanded his throne to be placed at the water's edge during an incoming tide, and then ordered the waves to halt their advance, only to be soaked by the rising waters as a demonstration to his flattering courtiers that royal power had limits that even kings could not transcend. The symbolic power of this story reflects deeper truths about Canute's approach to kingship and his understanding of the relationship between earthly authority and divine sovereignty. Unlike many medieval rulers who encouraged unlimited flattery and promoted exaggerated concepts of royal prerogative, Canute appears to have maintained a sophisticated understanding of both the possibilities and limitations of political power. Legend's emphasis on humility and recognition of divine authority aligns with other evidence about Canute's religious convictions and his efforts to present himself as a Christian king who governed according to divine principles rather than mere personal ambition. This approach to royal ideology helped distinguish him from earlier Viking rulers, while also appealing to Christian subjects throughout his territories. The choice of tidal demonstration as the vehicle for teaching about royal limitations was particularly appropriate for a ruler whose empire was fundamentally maritime in character. The tides represented natural forces that no human authority could control, providing a perfect metaphor for the divine powers that ultimately governed all earthly affairs. The story's popularity in later medieval literature suggests that it captured something essential about contemporary perceptions of ideal kingship, particularly the balance between effective royal authority and appropriate recognition of higher powers. This legend helped establish Canut's reputation as a wise and pious ruler, whose success reflected divine favor rather than mere human ambition. Various locations have been suggested as the site of this legendary demonstration, including Thorney Island, now Westminster, Bosham in West Sussex, and Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. Each of these locations possesses historical connections to Canut's reign, though the symbolic importance of the story far exceeds any concerns about geographical accuracy. Canut's relationship with the Christian Church represented one of the most successful aspects of his reign, demonstrating how genuine religious conviction could be combined with sophisticated political calculation to achieve both spiritual and temporal objectives. His transformation from Viking warrior to pious Christian king provided a model for the successful integration of Scandinavian political culture into the mainstream of European Christian civilization. The generosity of Canut's donations to religious institutions throughout his territories provided tangible evidence of his Christian commitment, while also creating valuable political alliances with ecclesiastical authorities, whose support was crucial for maintaining popular loyalty. The construction and endowment of churches and monasteries served both pious and practical purposes, creating centers of learning and administration that enhanced the effectiveness of royal government. The personal piety that characterized Canut's later years appears to have been genuine rather than merely politically motivated, reflecting perhaps both genuine spiritual conviction and growing awareness of his own mortality. His frequent participation in religious ceremonies and his careful attention to ecclesiastical protocol demonstrated respect for church authority that went beyond simple political calculation. The relationship that Canute developed with Archbishop Wulfstan of York proved particularly significant for both religious and governmental reasons. Wulfstan's influence on imperial legal policy helped ensure that Canut's governmental innovations remained consistent with Christian principles, while also providing ecclesiastical endorsement for controversial political decisions. The pilgrimage to Rome represented the culmination of Canut's religious development, demonstrating both personal devotion and sophisticated understanding of the international benefits that could be derived from visible demonstrations of Christian commitment. The diplomatic successes achieved during this journey provided lasting benefits for imperial interests, while also enhancing Canut's reputation throughout Christian Europe. The integration of Christian symbolism and ceremony into imperial governance helped create cultural bridges between different populations within territories, while also providing shared religious experiences that could supplement purely political bonds of loyalty and allegiance. One of the most remarkable aspects of Canut's reign was his success in managing the transition from the pagan Viking traditions of his youth to the Christian kingship of his maturity without completely alienating either constituency. This cultural balancing act required sophisticated understanding of both religious systems and careful attention to the sensitivities of diverse populations within his empire. The survival of pagan elements in the court poetry that celebrated Canut's achievements demonstrates his tolerance for traditional Scandinavian cultural expressions, even as he promoted Christian values in governmental policy. The skalds who praised his military victories continued to employ mythological references and pagan imagery that would have been unacceptable in purely Christian contexts. This cultural flexibility allowed Canute to maintain the loyalty of traditional Viking warriors, while also appealing to Christian subjects who expected their kings to govern according to religious principles. The ability to code switch between different cultural contexts, depending on his audience, demonstrated remarkable political sophistication and cultural sensitivity. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavian territories under Canute's rule proceeded through encouragement and example rather than force, reflecting his understanding that genuine religious conversion could not be achieved through political coercion. This patient approach to religious change helped minimize cultural conflicts while also ensuring that Christian conversion, when it occurred, would be lasting and sincere. The preservation of traditional Scandinavian legal and social customs within a Christian governmental framework demonstrated that cultural integration could be achieved without complete cultural assimilation. This approach provided models for managing religious and cultural diversity that would influence European political development for centuries. The death of Canute the Great on November 12, 1035, at Shaftesbury in Dorset, marked the end of an era and the beginning of the imperial collapse that would eliminate the North Sea Empire as a political reality within a single decade. The circumstances of his final illness and death remain largely mysterious, though contemporary sources suggest that he had been in declining health for some time before his final decline. The choice of Shaftesbury as the location of Canute's death may have been accidental, reflecting merely the progress of a royal journey that was interrupted by illness, or it may have reflected the king's desire to visit the shrine of St. Edward the Martyr, whose cult had become important in English religious life. The symbolic significance of a Danish king dying at one of England's most sacred sites was not lost on contemporary observers. The news of Canute's death spread rapidly throughout his empire, creating immediate uncertainty about succession arrangements and triggering the political maneuvering that would ultimately lead to imperial fragmentation. The complexity of his family arrangements and the unclear precedents for imperial succession created opportunities for ambitious nobles and rival claimants to pursue their own interests. The immediate reaction to Canute's death varied significantly across different portions of his empire, reflecting both the strength of local attachments to imperial unity and the extent of regional dissatisfaction with imperial governance. In England, where Canute's rule had brought unprecedented prosperity and security, his death was mourned as a genuine loss, while in Norway, the news was received as an opportunity for restored independence. The elaborate funeral arrangements that marked Canute's burial at Winchester Cathedral demonstrated both the respect that his achievements had earned and the uncertainty about whether his imperial legacy would survive his passing. The ceremony combined Christian religious observances with traditional royal honors in ways that reflected the cultural synthesis that had characterized his reign. The succession crisis that followed Canute's death demonstrated the fundamental weakness of imperial arrangements that had been held together primarily through personal loyalty to a single ruler, rather than institutional structures that could survive transitions in leadership. The division of imperial territories among multiple heirs virtually guaranteed conflicts that would drain imperial resources while also encouraging external intervention. Harold Harefoot's assumption of English royal authority faced immediate challenges from supporters of Harthacnet, who argued that his legitimate birth and mother's royal connections provided superior claims to English rule. This dynastic dispute divided English noble opinion while also creating opportunities for foreign powers to influence English political development. The regency arrangements that were initially established to manage the succession crisis proved inadequate for resolving the fundamental questions about imperial unity and the relationship between different portions of Canut's former territories. The attempt to maintain coordination between England and Denmark while managing Norwegian independence created administrative complexities that exceeded available governmental capabilities. Emma of Normandy's forced exile to Flanders demonstrated the extent to which political stability had depended upon Canut's personal authority, rather than established constitutional arrangements. The failure to protect the Queen Mother and her interests revealed the weakness of institutional structures that had seemed secured during Canut's lifetime. The rapidity with which imperial unity disintegrated following Canut's death suggests that the empire's apparent strength had masked fundamental centrifugal forces that had been contained but not eliminated by his political skills. The revival of regional nationalisms and the assertion of traditional local interests demonstrated that imperial integration had been less complete than had appeared during the height of Canut's power. The collapse of Danish authority in Norway began even before Canut's death, as the unpopularity of Glefgefu and Sweyn's administration had already triggered rebellions that would restore Norwegian independence under Magnus the Good. The return of Magnus from exile in Russia provided Norwegian resistance with legitimate royal leadership while also ensuring that Norwegian independence would be maintained through traditional dynastic authority. The ease with which Magnus was able to re-establish Norwegian independence demonstrated the fundamental weakness of imperial governance systems that relied primarily on military force rather than popular acceptance. The Danish administrative apparatus in Norway simply melted away when faced with determined resistance, backed by legitimate royal authority. The restoration of Norwegian independence represented more than merely local political change, as it broke the strategic unity of Canut's Scandinavian territories, while also providing an example that encouraged independence movements elsewhere within the former empire. The success of Norwegian resistance demonstrated that imperial authority could be successfully challenged by determined local opposition. The support that Magnus received from various Scandinavian powers illustrated the broader regional opposition to Danish imperial ambitions that had been building throughout Canut's reign. The coalition that formed to support Norwegian independence represented the reassertion of traditional political balances that had been temporarily disrupted by Canut's exceptional personal abilities. The conflict between Harald Harefoot and Harthacnut for control of England represented the final phase of imperial dissolution, as the inability to resolve succession questions peacefully demonstrated the failure of Canut's dynastic planning. The division of English political opinion between supporters of the two claimants created opportunities for external intervention while also weakening English resistance to foreign influence. Harold's success in establishing himself as English king reflected both his political skills and his ability to appeal to English nationalist sentiments that had been growing throughout the later years of Canut's reign. His presentation of himself as an English king rather than a Danish ruler helped distinguish him from Harthacnut, who remained more closely identified with Scandinavian political interests. The 3-year delay between Canut's death and Harthacnut's eventual assumption of English royal authority demonstrated the extent to which imperial coordination had depended upon personal leadership rather than institutional structures. The inability of imperial administrators to resolve succession questions efficiently highlighted fundamental weaknesses in governmental organization. Harthacnut's brief reign as king of both England and Denmark provided a temporary restoration of imperial unity, but his failure to establish stable governmental arrangements or produce heirs ensured that imperial fragmentation would continue after his death. His reputation for harsh governance and excessive taxation alienated English subjects while failing to restore effective imperial administration. The accession of Edward the Confessor in 1042 marked the definitive end of Scandinavian rule in England, and the restoration of the West Saxon royal house that Canute had displaced 30 years earlier. This dynastic restoration represented both the failure of Canute's succession planning and the ultimate triumph of English political identity over imperial integration. Edward's assumption of English royal authority was facilitated by the political exhaustion that had resulted from years of succession disputes and the recognition among English nobles that only a return to traditional dynastic legitimacy could provide the stability necessary for effective governance. The support that Edward received demonstrated the persistence of English national consciousness despite decades of foreign rule, the ease with which English political institutions adapted to the restoration of native royal authority highlighted the extent to which Canute's governmental innovations had been successfully integrated into English political culture. The administrative systems and legal procedures that had been developed during his reign continued to function effectively under English royal leadership. The international recognition that Edward received as legitimate English king demonstrated the broader European acceptance of the imperial collapse and the restoration of traditional political arrangements. The failure of Scandinavian powers to challenge Edward's accession reflected both their own internal political problems and their recognition that the imperial experiment had definitively failed. The ultimate failure of Canute's North Sea Empire should not obscure the remarkable nature of his achievements or the lasting influence that his reign had on the development of Northern European political culture. His success in creating and maintaining imperial unity for nearly 2 decades represented unprecedented political achievement that demonstrated the possibilities for supranational governance in medieval Europe. The administrative innovations that Canute developed for managing diverse populations and territories provided models for later medieval rulers who faced similar challenges in governing complex, multi-ethnic kingdoms. His approaches to federal governance, cultural integration, and economic coordination influenced political development throughout Northern Europe for centuries. The demonstration that Scandinavian political culture could successfully integrate with broader European Christian civilization helped accelerate the transformation of Northern European societies from their pagan, Viking origins toward full participation in medieval European culture. This cultural integration had lasting consequences that extended far beyond the political boundaries of Canute's empire. The failure of imperial succession arrangements provided cautionary lessons about the importance of institutional development and constitutional planning for political stability. Later, medieval rulers would learn from Canute's example the necessity of creating governmental structures that could survive transitions in leadership. The memory of Canute's empire continued to influence Northern European political imagination long after its collapse, providing inspiration for later attempts at Scandinavian unification, while also serving as a reminder of the potential for political achievement through wise and effective leadership. The legend of Canute and the tides became a permanent part of European political culture, providing a lasting symbol of wise kingship and appropriate humility that continued to influence concepts of royal authority throughout the medieval period and beyond. As we drift toward the peaceful shores of sleep, we can imagine the great king's spirit watching over the North Sea that once bore his fleets, content in the knowledge that though empires may fall and dynasties may end, the memory of wise and just rule lives forever in the hearts of those who understand that true greatness lies not in the extent of one's dominions, but in the love and respect of one's people. Thus concludes our gentle journey through the remarkable life of Canute the Great, England's forgotten Viking king whose empire stretched across the northern seas and whose legacy reminds us that even in ages of darkness, wisdom and courage can create islands of peace and prosperity that shine like beacons across the centuries. May your dreams be filled with the quiet satisfaction of great deeds accomplished and good governance achieved. Sleep well, dear dreamer, until history calls us together once again.